narrative quite well by just listening to it over and over. And as India mentioned, you do get narrators doing all the different accents. Sometimes they're not so good. Sometimes they're very good, though. And they help explain and contextualize in a way the dialect that you might find, for instance, in Wuthering Heights. Hello, everyone. Everyone's kind of slowly coming in. Maybe you guys have got your feedback and you're all a bit annoyed or you're a bit happy or whatnot. Please do read my comments, and I apologize if there's any typos in them. I kind of don't get much time to allotted to do the marking, but I try to make sure that whatever I'm commenting is helpful. So have a look at the in-text markups and the general comments. But also, if you want to kind of send an email saying, you know, you missed something here or you missed something there, please do that. Generally, they're all fairly good. No one failed at all, which is good to see. Some were excellent. Some were better than I've ever seen before. Some of you I felt could have written better assignments if you had have had the time or put the time in. Some of you, however, I felt really did want to write better assignments, but you kind of might just need me to kind of help you point out perhaps the right direction to head in areas. But also, I did find a few of you had great ideas, and the thinking was fine, and the analysis was fine, but the expression was kind of what was letting you down. So if I've kind of mentioned you in the feedback that, hey, I can kind of show you what's going on wrong there, just reach out and we can have a chat about it, because often I find it's merely a problem of conveying ideas rather than not having any ideas. I did have another comment about, this was a general one, and I want to get to the bottom of it because I don't know, I keep getting romance and realism students that do this. Not all of you did it, only maybe about 25%, but somewhere along the line you've been told to do this by someone, some absolute knucklehead, and I want to know who's telling you to put your citations in after a sentence is finished. Has anyone kind of been told that you reference a source that you say have quoted, not at the end of the sentence, but at the beginning of the next sentence? Olivia, you've got thumbs up there. Have you got a name? Because I want to track this person down.
No, I don't. I feel like I've just been told it straight from the start that after you've put in an in-text quote, you just reference after.
Yeah. Inja, you've got thumbs up there.
Do you mean like you've put in your quote or whatever, and then before you finish the sentence, you've put it in the brackets?
Yeah, so if I jump in the chat here,
always been taught that.
Yeah.
Like from the very, very start of my uni degree, I've been told to do it like that.
Me too, and I honestly hate it. Like, it's such a pain because sometimes I want to use multiple quotes.
Just wait. I'm just going to type it in the chat because this is what I'm talking about. 2022, blah, 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 page 34. So this is one sentence. And for some reason, some people do this. They put a full stop there and then start the next sentence. Chris also had a dog. And some people do this. It's not a big issue, but it's just driving me nuts because I keep getting students coming and they're putting their references at the beginning of the next sentence, which kind of, it's driving me a little bit nuts, but it's not a big deal. Don't worry. You didn't lose any marks for that for doing that. But yeah, I wouldn't mind, because clearly you've been told to do that by someone and it just doesn't make any logic at all. So always have your reference kind of belonging to the sentence in which you are referencing, particularly with Harvard. Another general piece of feedback I probably gave to the majority of you, which I don't think anyone, maybe 50% take because they don't like the idea of doing it. But if you can, read your writing back to yourself, or ask someone to read it for you, get a friend to have a look at your assessment. I know this can be embarrassing, but it will help you spot like all of these little typos and things that may have been missed. Ryan, you've got a question, go for it.
So the question I had, Chris, is just in a lot of these novels that we're reading at the moment, there's a lot of two-way sort of conversations happening. So how am I meant to be referencing that in regards to Harvard? Because it's like, even in the writing or the report I did before, there was a conversation between Elizabeth and Darcy, but it's sort of like the one quote or the one sentence.
Oh, yeah, great question, Ryan. Very simply answered. You don't either reference Elizabeth or Darcy, you reference Austen, because Austen is the author of Pride and Prejudice. So you would have Austen 1813, colon, or comma, page 28, and you'd enclose that in parentheses. So you don't need to reference, because they're not actual human beings. So just reference the author of the document, whether it be a primary source or a secondary source. Does that answer your question? It is a bit confusing, I think, how precise we want the referencing to be.
Yeah, I just thought I'd ask, because one of the previous lectures wanted us to mention the character.
Oh, really?
Okay.
No, well, maybe there's wires crossed in the sense that maybe it was not to do with the referencing, but to mention the character who's speaking kind of in the sentence before they're being referenced or something like that. But no, definitely don't quote Heathcliff in the parentheses, because Heathcliff didn't write Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte did. Yeah, it is a bit confusing. Ryan asked a really good question. Does anyone have any other questions? I'm just kind of checking the chat.
I have a question about when we're talking about the novel that we're writing. Does it have to be in italics every time we mention it?
For me, yes. Always, if you're talking about a book or a standalone piece of work that's quite lengthy, it deserves italics. That just emphasizes for the reader that it's a work of art or a work of literature. Poems, you usually put two quote things. Great question, Amber, because I'll give you out my own little mini style manual that I wrote that answers all and every question you could ever have. It's about 13 pages long. And I wrote it just because people kind of often don't know these little aspects to their writing that can help them out and do things. I did notice, it was great to see actually, because a lot of people were trying to kind of let the reader know, hey, this is a novel, and they were using quotations or they were underscoring it. And some people, some tutors do not really mind, but if you actually grab a book from your library shelf and look at the way a book is represented, it'll usually be in italics. And to that, the first time you should introduce a book, such as Pride and Prejudice, you want to have little parentheses or brackets with the date of publication, just the first time you mention it. But I will send out my little mini style thing probably after we do our essay plans next week, because I don't want to bombard you with too much information right now. And I'll also send out a mini essay example, one I wrote that I think Olivia will know about, because I just wrote it to help the students in poetry and poetics when I was teaching that last block, that will show you some formatting principles. I think there were a good deal of you that have already learned most of those formatting principles. But if you jazz up your writing and present it a bit better, it's going to bump up your mark. And it's not just for me. You'll see that in other units. If you do a certain things like double spacing, even though they don't tell you to do it, they're kind of conventions, they're kind of implied laws that kind of, when people come to read assessments, they go, oh, have they done that? Have they done this? Why is it all one kind of big, gigantic kind of descending chaos written in 9-point type? Because bear in mind, like, I had to read all of these in a very short time, so you can get feedback and know how you're going. And when they're kind of well presented, it's just such a relief. And actually, you know, the person that was teaching this before they went to block mode, he kind of eventually went blind because he just marked so many assessments over so many years. Maybe it was because all the students didn't double space or something. So yeah, double space. Otherwise, you know, even unless you're super cruel, one may go blind. Any other questions? If you kind of, yeah, if I've said, hey, I can show you something, do send an email and I'll kind of will help you out, because writing something I kind of enjoy doing. And yeah, I think sometimes you guys just need to be pointed in the right direction. And once you're pointed in the right direction, there's not going to be an issue. Often I find, however, that kind of people don't get pointed in the right direction and the kind of problem persists, and it's frustrating because you need to know what you're doing right and you also need to know what you're doing wrong. So I'm perfectly willing kind of some time kind of during the day or kind of before or after class to do a mini Zoom and go through certain aspects of your assessment where you're just confused and you don't know what happened there. Some of you, I think, and I think this is fair to say, could do a lot better and you're just a little slack. Having said that, like if you're trying your damned hardest and it's not working out, then kind of reach out, because you know, kind of if there are problems and you're trying really hard, then kind of you should get assistance in terms of doing that. I do think there are student mentoring kind of places you can go at VU. Has anyone tried them out, India?
I haven't, but I was just going to say about the double spacing thing. I like doing double spacing, but I feel like every unit I've gone to, it's different. Like the last one I was in, they wanted 1.5 spacing, and she was really strict. She was like, if you don't follow this, you've lost your marks and stuff. So I think like for me, I was like, it's good that I think it said double spacing somewhere, which is why I need to do double. But yeah, I feel like everywhere is so different.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is, and I think a lot of you probably get very confused as you move from unit to unit, and also as you move from discipline to discipline. I do mention that in my mini style guide, and the style guide only really pertains to literary studies, and I'm really trying to colonize the whole literary studies area with my style guide. But yeah, there are to India's point though, 1.5 is definitely better than 0.1. Give it some space. The reason why is because often I'll find that you've missed a word and I'll want to say, hey, look, there's a word missing and I can't chuck it in there because there's no space. And then when you get your feedback, it's all a jumble of mess because I've kind of inserted words and things that you kind of have trouble seeing. One thing I might also notice is you may have got more feedback than usual. That's because I like getting lots of feedback. It may not actually be a reflection on your assessment being bad because there's all this markups going on everywhere. Some of the comments will just often be just kind of ideas that I've kind of thought were interesting, or suggestions in terms of maybe the tense is wrong in this sentence, or kind of a general question that I often ask is that a sentence? Are you writing sentences? And what on earth are you doing with those semicolons? Like that is like a serious issue, but it's not an issue you're going to lose marks on, but it's an issue that kind of, it's something people get a little angry about. But let's go ahead and start today. But if anyone has any questions about their assessments, yeah, shoot me an email or hang around after class or whatnot, because yeah, I'm more than willing to help out there and kind of point out kind of where I thought you were going well and where I think you could go a lot better. You guys seeing, I've changed my backdrop because we're looking at the Gothic and the Sublime today. This is the mountain K2, which is in the Himalayas. I think it's in the Karakoram, which is kind of connected to the Himalayas in northern Pakistan. Long to go there one day. India, Ryan, can you give me a thumbs up if you're seeing this, or Camille?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, I'm just double checking. Yeah. Sometimes I've actually gone into I've done like a 45-minute ramble and I've realized no one's actually even seeing my slides, which is not so great. All right, so let's commence. Today we're looking at the second kind of section of Wuthering Heights, and what I think we're going to do is talk about the critical reaction to Wuthering Heights first, and then look at the Gothic aspects to Wuthering Heights. And interspersed between this, I do have some activities, particularly one starting quite soon, but I'm hoping to kind of break down the wall of my kind of ranting onwards. So I'm hoping that you guys might kind of be able to write a mini review of Wuthering Heights. Those of you who have read it, hopefully those of you who have decided not to read Wuthering Heights because you wanted to focus on Tess have seen an adaptation at least, so you can write a mini review. It doesn't have to be a gloating positive one, it can be a negative one. Then we're going to look at why Wuthering Heights was received so differently, and we'll look at it in terms of its relationship to this big idiom or aesthetic paradigm called the Gothic, which has kind of many tropes and themes embedded in it. Then we'll have a break. We'll continue to look at the Gothic, but we'll look at how the Gothic relates to this big aesthetic and artistic concept called the sublime. I'm not talking about really good chocolate ice cream here, which often gets described as sublime. I'm talking about this chap Edmund Burke's idea of the sublime, which he kind of conceptualized in the middle of the 18th century. Then we'll look at kind of Heathcliff's possible representation as a Byronic hero. And then we'll intersperse with this, I'll have a whole bunch of questions about the Gothic in our own lives, particularly about, whether Melbourne is a Gothic place. Does anyone know what this picture is of here? This is a photo I took. Does anyone might know where we are? It's very vague.
Is that the Melbourne Cemetery?
Yeah, it is, Ryan. How did you know that?
The gate.
The gate, the fence on the side, right? This is of the side of the Melbourne General Cemetery. And as you see, if you go to the Melbourne General Cemetery, you'll find that it's lined. It's a very old and wonderful and beautiful cemetery. I used to go run around there as a teenager. It's lined with these elm trees, and coincidentally, a bit of a trigger warning here. A couple of years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, or 3 years ago, a jogger, because it's on Princess Park, was actually killed by one of these trees. It got dislodged from the earth, and she was just running past at the time when the tree fell and crushed the poor lady to death. Kind of very bad luck, very kind of creepy in a way. But if you go to the Melbourne General Cemetery, you'll notice that on one of the avenues right next to the fence, this is the cemetery fence here, if you can see my mouse, there's this Australian ghost gum tree, this native ghost gum tree that kind of comes shooting out of the ground. And my camera wasn't so good, so I couldn't get a full view, but it goes over the cemetery fence and it's strangling one of these cypress trees over here. It's just a very bizarre, weird and spooky occurrence that's worth looking at in terms of Melbourne and the Gothic. It's just very kind of strange and kind of somewhat creepy. And I think we'll have a discussion about, has anyone kind of had similar kind of Gothic experiences, or does anyone know of certain spaces that they would deem Gothic in the Australian kind of context or the Melburnian context? I want to return you back to that little rant I gave kind of at the second session we had on Jane Austen, when I was trying to convince you about why Austen is kind of important, not just in terms of literature, but how she shows us what some literature does. And I kind of suggested that one of the central functions of Austen's literature and literature more broadly is not only to create narratives that explain the social organization of the world. If you think about myths and stories of Genesis, that's what a lot of myths do. They just tell us why the world is, and that's one of the functions of literature. But a lot of great literature kind of identifies social problems and uses narrative structures like romance to resolve them, or identify why they cannot currently be resolved without significant social change. This is why I think perhaps a good deal of artists tend to be branded seditious, subversive, social justice warrior types, because the stories they tend to tell are quite ideologically vehement, and they can both uphold and destroy the status quo. This is also why I think we turn to literature in times of crisis, because as Darcy kind of says to Lizzie at the end of Pride and Prejudice, it teaches us to hope for something better. So one definition of literature is this idea that it has a social function in narrating the achievability of a moral and just universe. Of course, you might, and some of you did in your critical analysis of the relationships in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, go, hey, you know, it upholds a certain view of the moral universe, but it's not really poetically just by our standards. Nonetheless, one version of literature kind of has this function to kind of show the way the world is and perhaps suggest the way the world can be better, made better. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because we're coming to Wuthering Heights, which is a lot different in a number of respects in terms of literature's social value and the way it kind of might exist as kind of functioning or have a social purpose. If you think about the definition of literature as having a social function, it really is tethered. Art is tethered to society or chained to society. Art kind of purpose is to serve social welfare in the community. So in one way, it's subordinated to the material world, and in a way, kind of maybe politicians would like that to be the way it is, because they can show people why literature is economically viable. But there is also a much more modern definition of art that contends, as Oscar Wilde famously put it in the preface to his own Gothic novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, all great art is essentially useless. All great art is essentially useless. What he meant by this is that great literature should not really be chained to one social purpose. Rather, art and literature more broadly, and literature is an art form, should really be about freedom. Freedom of expression, but also the creation of something that is autonomous or divorced from the material world. Art should exist, and it probably does exist, as one of the only places where we can be absolutely free from the material demands of life, money, the body, but also death. And I think there's some truth here when we think about Emily Bronte, because I did mention on Monday that Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights and died a bit of a nobody. Bronte is dead, but just walk into about any bookshop as Kaylee did, and she bought Wuthering Heights, and you'll find there is this thing called Wuthering Heights, and when you read it, it really does come alive. Why am I telling you this? Well, I think it's important when you're doing literary studies for someone to say, hey, literature is very important for kind of two gigantic reasons, and the world may not tell you that it's important, but it is important. Secondly, the reason why I'm telling you this is because I think the darkness or the autonomous and amoral nature of Wuthering Heights, which is very different in ending from Pride and Prejudice, might speak to Bronte's disinterest in pleasing the world. Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights not to please the world, but perhaps to kind of say, hey, this is the way the world is, and I'm going to represent it the way it is, and I'm going to do it with my own creative mind's eye. Added to this, I also think Bronte's kind of divorce from kind of being a social justice warrior also speaks to why her novel was so negatively criticized when it appeared, when it came out in 1847. So to kind of return you guys, to give you a little bit of the backstory, which I probably did very impoverishedly yesterday, the Bronte sisters published most of their famous novels concurrently in 1847. Wuthering Heights, Agnes Grey came out together, and Jane Eyre came out at the same time. Jane Eyre was published by a chap called Smith. He owned a company called Smith, Elder & Co. And Wuthering Heights was published together by Thomas Courtney Newby in December of that year. Very different publication arrangement. Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte or Currer Bell got £100, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but you're probably looking an equivalent of like 25 grand or something, which is a huge chunk of money. I wouldn't mind $25,000. Having said that, for writing Jane Eyre, you're probably looking at $25 million today, or I reckon maybe it's probably, the text itself is probably in the billions in terms of how much revenue it makes Penguin and people that publish it. when Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey were published by Newbie, it was kind of this publish at your own risk. They put up some money. Newbie, I think, put up some money as well, but it was it was not a very fair publication contract. The only reason why Newbie ended up publishing it in December is because Jane Eyre went on to be a huge success. And Jane Eyre was probably the most famous and most successful book of the mid-19th century. Agnes Grey, Anne Bronte's novel, was completely overlooked and seen as very inferior to both Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. Wuthering Heights, however, and we'll read some of the reviews now, was viciously, almost universally attacked by critics as vulgar. So let's have a look at some of the reviews, and this is from the Athenaeum, which is probably one of the most prestigious literary journals of the Victorian period, of the 19th century, kind of a space where people come together to kind of celebrate high culture. And I'm wondering if anyone would like to read this passage. Maybe they could sound a bit snobby while they're reading it.
I'll take the gauntlet.
Go, Ryan.
In spite of much power and cleverness, in spite of its truth to life in remote nooks and corners of England, Wuthering Heights is a disagreeable story. The bells seem to affect painful and exceptional subjects, the misdeeds and oppressions of tyranny, the eccentricities of woman's fantasy. They do not turn away from the dwelling upon those physical acts of cruelty which we know to have their warrant in the real annals of crime and suffering, but the contemplation of which true taste rejects. The brutal master of the lonely house of Wuthering Heights, a prison which might be pictured from life, has doubtless had his prototype in those ungeneral and remote districts where human beings like the trees grow gnarled and dwarfed and distorted by the inclement climate. But he might have been indicated with far fewer touches in place of so entirely filling the canvas that there is hardly a scene untainted by his presence. 25th,
Thank you.
1847.
Thanks, Ryan. That was great. You kind of affected a bit of snobbishness there, I felt. You kind of sounded like you maybe had a few sherries and, were ready to kind of freeload on the author of this novel. Anyone can jump in here. Well, what's the critic taking exception to generally in Wuthering Heights? Is it the style in which the narrative is told, or is it certain themes?
I thought he was talking about mostly the character of the owner.
The brutal master of the lonely house. Who would that be?
The landlord. I don't know his name just yet.
He's got the most iconic name in all of literature. Heathcliff, yes, it's Heathcliff, the brutal master of the lonely house on Wuthering Heights. A prison which might be pictured from life. So he's talking about Heathcliff towards the end of this. Is he also the critic? It is a male critic. I'm pretty sure it is, and I'd probably be 100% sure it's a male critic, but I may be wrong. What are they also taking issue with? I think he's got it in rabbit ears.
So there's two that he could potentially have. So there's Worthington Heights as itself, and then the eccentricities of woman's fantasy.
The eccentricities of woman's fantasies. The bells seem to affect painful and exceptional subjects. The misdeeds and oppression of tyranny, the eccentricities of woman's fantasy. You might wonder why he's kind of, gone woman's fantasy. They do not turn away from dwelling on those physical acts of cruelty, which we know to have their warrant in the real annals of crime and suffering, but the contemplation of which true taste rejects. So is this critic saying, in a way, you shouldn't really be writing about, for instance, the way Catherine Heathcliff gets locked up by Heathcliff? That's not great literature. Issues of domestic violence, issues of kind of patriarchal kind of tyranny, maybe they're not worthwhile to focus on. Before I move on to another criticism, is there any kind of light at the end of the tunnel in terms of, are there some positive aspects, or is it all just negative in this review?
I guess his comments about the nature, are maybe somewhat of a compliment. Like maybe that's what Bronte was kind of trying to achieve, this sort of, nature being a character in the novel. So maybe that's, are you positive?
Yes, you're thinking towards the end where the critic kind of has taken on a bit of a Gothic aspect, where he's gone, those ungenial and remote districts where human beings like trees grow gnarled and dwarfed and distorted by inclement climate. What about the first clause in this review? In spite of much power and cleverness. I think the critic here objects to the content, but is willing to admit that this person, whoever wrote this novel, is quite a good writer. They're just disturbed. They're a disturbed individual from the north. Would anyone like to read this review from The Spectator, which is somewhat liberal, somewhat conservative? I wouldn't mind reading a review from a radical newspaper. I could probably dig one up. I see Maddie, are you there? Could you read it? Sorry, I'm just going to pick someone because I don't want to read it.
Yeah, I can read it.
Go for it.
An attempt to give novelty and interest to fiction by resorting to those singular characters that used to exist everywhere, but especially in retired and remote places. The success is not equal to the abilities of the writer, chiefly because the incidents are too coarse and disagreeable to be attractive, the very best being improbable with a moral taint about them, and the villainy not leading to results sufficient to justify the elaborate pains taken in depicting it. The execution, however, is good. Grant the writer all that is requisite as regards matter, and the delineation is forcible and truthful.
Thanks, Maddie. It sounds like you've got a bit of a croaky voice. I hope I kind of, you don't have a cold or something.
I'm fine. I'm all
you're
right.
fine. Good.
Thanks.
Is this a little similar to the Athenaeans review? Is there positives here as well as negatives? What do you think, Amber? Is this a positive review or a negative one?
I think it has both aspects. Initially it does seem a lot more negative, but I guess if you kind of look a bit closer, like where was it? There's a part, I've lost it. There's a part that when I was rereading it the second time made me realize that they do appreciate the writing. I guess just not the themes.
Yeah, they're saying it's a moral writing in a way, like it's a great portrait of horrible things.
Yeah, exactly.
Chiefly because the incidents are too coarse and disagreeable to be attractive, the very best being improbable, with a moral taint about them, and the villainy not leading to the results sufficient to justify the elaborate pains taken in depicting it. Does anyone think this is true of Wuthering Heights, those of you who have managed to plow through it? I guess the criticism of Bronte here is that she's perverse. She, like there's a dead cat on the side of the road and Bronte gets out her notepad and she's like, the eyes protrude, distended. You have to see the veins as they come out. Was that true of the novel? Was it too perverse, too grotesque?
I don't think so. Like, especially after reading Tess as well, like it's not that, it's just darker. And I think maybe that is why this person is a bit, I guess, taken aback, because it's not a common writing of the time. And she kind of changed the game. And with anyone that writes in a way that changes the game, you're always going to have a lot more negative than positive writing, like reviews.
Yes, that's a great point, Amber, that when you do set a new standard or do create something totally original, you're going to provoke responses. Some will be positive, but a lot will be negative, because like you're rupturing the status quo and the conservative nature of how we view the world in terms of our norms. The execution is good, however. Grant the writer all that is requisite as regards matter, and the delineation forcible and truthful. So it's getting a bit more positive. Let's have a look at this review by the Examiner. Caitlin, do you reckon you can read it? I can just see you there in one of the boxes. Well, you're disturbed. You've just read Wuthering Heights. You're an English gentleman. Someone's just brought in your tobacco, and so throw my phone away. Someone's ringing. You're kind of, you're a bit disturbed. You've seen a young lady who's written something horribly beautiful. Hold on, no, wait. All right. Here's more character prompt for you. You're like an old conservative man who's seen a teenage girl with an eyebrow ring and green hair on the train. That might be the voice. Thank you. That was great. Yeah, you're very disturbed at seeing young people with green hair, but nonetheless, you're almost contemplating, hey, maybe green hair ain't so bad. It's a new thing. It's a new look. And Emily Bronte's changed my sensibilities when it comes to green hair. Is this a little bit more positive? Is it true? Is this what the book is about? Is this like someone gossiping, Is it about savages ruder than those who lived before the days of Homer? Is Wuthering Heights that far gone?
I think it's a bit dramatic. Like, this writing is a bit dramatic. It's like, it's intense, and there's some graphic and I guess sad scenes, but it's not. I don't know why everyone's being so dramatic, to be honest.
I think to understand why it's so dramatic, you need to take yourself away from our era and put yourself back into 1848, where everyone was conservative. So to talk about this sort of stuff, like whilst it happened, was probably a little bit taboo, because, oh my God, a woman showed her ankles.
Yeah, I kind of definitely context matters a lot here in terms of thinking about how the conservative old gentleman might view Emily Bronte's radical text. But I do agree with Amber in the sense that there were texts written during the period, particularly by men. A lot of male kind of dandies would write very extravagant kind of romances that were very seditious in terms of sexuality, but they were known as being kind of roués or rakes, so they kind of got away with it, and kind of, yeah, it is nevertheless, Amber, I think you might agree or might not. There are some scenes, I don't know if we'll look at them in particular. There is a scene, for instance, where if anyone's interested in just sheer violence, where Heathcliff basically boots someone's head in, boots their head in, and then a knife fight ensues. And as Isabella, who throws knives at Heathcliff, gets one stuck in her neck, as she runs out the door of Wuthering Heights, Hurton Earnshaw is hanging a litter of puppies. It is very, 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 very violent and very rustic in the extreme. So yeah, context helps a little bit, but yeah. Here we've got, I think this is the last one we'll look at before I ask you to write your own review. Who can I ask to read this? I don't like suggesting people, but would anyone like to read this? It's very similar to the last review. It's from Douglas Jerrold's Weekly Examiner. And to give you some context, this is to a certain extent the equivalent of The Guardian newspaper today. Very liberal, kind of progressive leaning, kind of open to new ideas. Dana, would you like to read it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wuthering Heights is a strange sort of book, baffling all regular criticism. Yet it is impossible to begin and not finish it, and quite as impossible to lay it aside afterwards and say nothing about it. In the midst of the reader's perplexity, the ideas predominant in his mind concerning this book are likely to be brutal cruelty and semi-savage love. What may be the moral which the author wishes the reader to deduce from his work, it is difficult to say, and we refrain from assigning any because we speak honestly. We have discovered none but mere glimpses of hidden morals or secondary meanings. There seems to us great power in this book, but a purposeless power, which we feel a great desire to see turned to better account. In Wuthering Heights, the reader is shocked, disgusted, almost sickened by details of cruelty, inhumanity, and the most diabolical hate and vengeance. But we strongly recommend all our readers who love novelty to get this story, for we can promise them that they never have read anything like it before. It is very puzzling and very interesting.
Thank you. Is this kind of a fairer assessment of Wuthering Heights? Does the critic kind of say something here about what disturbs them is the issue of the meaning of the book? Does Wuthering Heights have a moral?
I suppose in this it just kind of says hidden morals, so it's probably not some that are like obvious, but I don't know.
No, it's a good starting point, Olivia. When you read or watched Pride and Prejudice, did you feel like there was an ideological message that why is her name Jane Austen was disseminating?
I'm going to say something about Pride and Prejudice. I think, unfortunately, because and due to its popularity, it's one of those stories where you know exactly what's going to happen even before you've seen it or read it.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ryan. It's embedded in our cultural psyche. Most romances are, right? You realize that something, the two protagonists are going to end up getting together by the close of the novel. Camille, you wrote about this in your assessment for the first assessment. Does Pride and Prejudice have a certain ideological message?
Yeah, I'd actually say that there's quite a few, like things about pride, things about prejudice, things about feminism, things about, marrying for love and, personal choice over family obligations, things like that can be taken away from it.
Is there morality in the sense that Lydia runs away and that's somewhat condemned, and we need to think cautiously about our agency in the world, perhaps, if we want to end up at Pemberley.
Yeah, 100%. So
yeah,
it
so
is very much condemned.
And it's almost a question of whether that ideological message is kind of, she's just doing it because she knows that's what's expected, because it was expected during the time that you would write a novel that conveyed moral messages to the community, because that's what literature was all about. Kind of, you would have a moral. To that point, after reading Wuthering Heights, Camille, can you kind of say that there's a moral to the story of kind of what happens with Heathcliff and Catherine? And
there's things you can say. I don't know if I could pinpoint the moral or like the main one, but definitely the idea that we spoke about last class about evil isn't born, it's created, and things like that. I think that's a big one.
Yeah, I think that's a challenging moral as well, particularly when you're living in a conservative Judeo-Christian community where there's this thing called the devil, and the devil creates evil. When someone comes along and says, no, you're actually responsible for the child that's raised in that community, and if you don't raise that child well as a community, not just as a mother or a father, but as a community, that child might grow up to do some problematic things. That's a very challenging moral. I do kind of think there are some morals to Wuthering Heights, but this reviewer kind of can't really see any moral, which kind of brings me to another question. Sorry for you guys that are still getting through, and sorry, there's going to be a spoiler alert. Does Wuthering Heights have a happy ending? How does Wuthering Heights end? Quite literally. Can anyone kind of remember what the last scene of Wuthering Heights is?
Is the last scene with Heathcliff in the he leaves the window open? Is that the last scene?
No, it's further down the track. We return to Lockwood, and Heathcliff's dead. Heathcliff's dead. Lockwood goes, actually, I had a picture before of the place, and he looks at something. Sorry, I might be like kind of setting you up for kind of some cryptic answer. Does anyone know kind of where it ends at the very end? Some of us, I would like my life to end where it ends in Wuthering Heights, but I don't think I'll afford to end where it ends now.
Isn't it in a cemetery?
Yeah, it's the cemetery. Lockwood's like staring down
and
at the tombstone
or something. Is there a ghost?
Yeah, there's an anecdote as well. Just before he goes to the to the graveyard to look at the graves, there's an anecdote that a small little shepherd boy has been seeing them haunting the moors. So there's this idea that they've transcended material reality and they live on the moors. But very different from the ending of Pride and Prejudice, where everyone ends up at Mount Olympus, Pemberley, having a jolly good time, sipping on nectar and ambrosia, cognac and whatnot, living it up with like Gucci sweaters and things. Wuthering Heights ends in a graveyard where Lockwood stares down at the tombstones, which are covered in moss. And there's two moths like flitting around, and he's just left wondering, what was that all about? Like, what was this story about? What was the meaning of Wuthering Heights? That shocked the reader for a variety of reasons. We'll get into it when we turn to look at the Gothic. But Victorian readers, and to Ryan's point, but also to Amber's kind of defense of Wuthering Heights, Victorian readers did expect that you would tell a moral tale. And you don't really get that in Wuthering Heights. But Camille's point also, there are morals embedded in Wuthering Heights, but they're quite progressive and quite radical morals, and they're not shoved down your throat. They're not really rammed down your throat. To a certain extent, we could say that Wuthering Heights does have a romantic ending with the second generation of Hareton and Cathy II coming together. Cathy teaches Hareton how to read, and it's all wonderful because they fall in love. And you could wonder that maybe the whole idea of Wuthering Heights is Heathcliff just exerted his evil diabolical revenge to create a level playing field so that Hurton could find true love. And that's what the purpose of Wuthering Heights was in that respect. But again, it's very ambiguous and it's very open to argumentation, whereas Jane Austen's novel is a bit ideologically limited because of the explicit messaging that goes on throughout the narrative. I do think there are grounds to argue in Austen's defense here, but nonetheless, the ending of Wuthering Heights is very open-ended. So from these criticisms, I think if we were to closely read them, critics tend to agree that this person called Alice Bell, and if you'll notice here, what identity do they think Alice Bell is? What gender, sorry?
Man.
He's a man, his mind, predominant in his mind. So a lot of the critics just assumed quite naturally during this age, of course, women were so kind of polite and genteel and maternal, filled with sensibility. They were into hugging puppies and, you know, giving candy to poor people and sewing stockings and things, that this just could not have been written by a woman. They nevertheless agree that this person, whoever wrote this novel, has serious literary skill. And if you do read Wuthering Heights closely, Sarisha mentioned when she, at the end of yesterday's class, that she quite loved it. It was quite a beautiful, vivid and detailed book. And there is a lot of horror and a lot of disturbing aspects in Wuthering Heights, but it is very beautifully told and very skillfully told. In fact, I think of all the sisters, Emily Bronte was by far the most superior writer. But critics kind of tend to agree that the book is totally immoral. It's strange. It's just weird. It's incredibly vulgar. It has characters like Joseph. It has characters like Heathcliff, who uses the word slut all the time to refer to middle-class women. It is extremely violent. It has an irregular structure. The reviewer in Gerald's, for instance, kind of complains about the structure in a way, but he also, and this I think is central to all of them, claim that the book has no clear moral. And the Examiner describes the narrative as confused, disjointed, and improbable, which to a certain extent you might agree or might not agree. And the Athenaeum kind of connects it to this, you know, thing, the eccentricities of woman's fantasy. You know, why write a novel about woman's fantasy? Why write about Catherine Linton's kind of psychosis that occurs just before she gives birth to her child? Why write about that? We don't want to deal with social issues like that. We want dashing heroes and buccaneers swooping in and saving the day for Great Britain. All right, I'd like you guys now, particularly those of you who have plowed through Wuthering Heights, to write your own mini review of Wuthering Heights. And to set you up for answering it, I might just ask you to respond to this question. Would you recommend the novel to a friend or somebody to read? So I might give you just 10 minutes. I don't think you'll need much longer to pen out a little mini review. It doesn't have to be polished. It doesn't have to be a work of profound genius. And it can be perfectly honest. You can say, I didn't like the novel because of A, B, and C. Do try and give reasons. It was too long, maybe, or because of certain other aspects. If you did like the novel, kind of explain what aspects you liked about the novel. So I'll give you 10 minutes. What's the time? 6:55 now. 10 minutes, I'll be silent, and we'll reconvene at 7:05. And I'll ask some of you, hopefully, to volunteer your reviews. They don't have to be, you know, the greatest reviews, just some reactions. Would you recommend the book to a friend, or wouldn't you recommend the book to a friend? Does anyone know how to spell hottie? I've never written it before. Yeah, like some people say someone's a hottie, or he's a hottie.
H HOTTIE.
Oh, good. Ah, good. Hey, the red spell thing went off. There's my review coming in. Oh no, I forgot he, even though he cannot read. Oh, we'll read them out if we like. I won't force anyone to read theirs. But I just thought I'd chuck mine in there while I'm waiting for people to come in. Still got a couple more minutes.
I like that you did Kathy ×1 and Kathy ×2. If that was in the book, would have made things so much clearer.
You've just got to remember. They're very different though. Like Kathy 1 is extremely violent. There's a scene where she abuses a child, then hits her potential husband, and then smacks a servant, all in like the space of 100 words.
Classic Kathy 1.
Yeah. But I think one of the reasons why Kathy is so violent is because Heathcliff's also violent. So their toxicity would kind of dovetail into each other, perhaps. But it may be because they're so violent because their love's negated. Perhaps violence is the byproduct of not being loved. I don't know if anyone reads with their cat, but if they have a cat, it's always good to have a cat with you when you're reading. There's definitely cats out there, Caitlin, and yeah, there's lots of cat shelters. You can get a cat.
That's part of having a cat. You lose all your furniture.
Because they love smarming and kind of clawing on them. Yeah, if you want a cat. All right. We're back. We've had 10, 11 minutes, maybe interrupted a little bit by me. I'll get the ball rolling by reading my review. Wuthering Heights is the bomb. Hurton Earnshaw is such a hottie. Even though he cannot read, he knows how to hunt rabbits and upturn a currant bush, and he'd do anything for Kathy X2. As for Kathy X1, she is more true to life than Courtney Love. A must read, especially with a cup of cocoa and Precious Garfield sitting on your lap. The fire's burning, Lachlan. The fire's burning. I don't even know how to interpret that emoji. Yeah. But
Yeah,
also, perhaps, yeah, maybe that would even be better with a blazing fire and the cat and the novel and a cup of cocoa, perhaps with snow falling outside, which is rare now. No, a little kind of, I don't know, one of those recliners, I guess. Okay, would anyone like to read their review, please?
I'll read mine if you'd like.
Go, Amber.
It's so funny that we're doing this just before one of my girlfriends posted that she's reading this right now, just as like a coincidence. And she's only just started reading. And I said, oh, I've read that too. And she goes, what do you think? I said, it's a lot. That's how I described it. So that's what I based this off.
Hold on. What does it mean when someone says it's a lot? Like that is a loaded term.
As in, like, it's a lot to process, and it is a loaded term because it's so hard to explain. So I tried to put it in this little one, but I wrote, Wuthering Heights is a book everyone should read once. It's a novel that you need to be prepared to read, as it is very different to books that are written today. I would recommend it to my friends who like something out of the ordinary and aren't afraid of a little madness. It's a book that superficially seems like a love story, but underneath it's a book about how abuse and trauma can alter a person and the ramifications of their abuse to their loved one's experience. It almost feels like a nightmare and a lovely dream have collided into a Frankenstein novel, which is perplexing, intense, horrific, and beautiful all at the same time.
Oh, that was great. That was great. I'm interested that you mentioned Frankenstein, and I actually was going to talk about Frankenstein today, but I never got around to putting information into my slides. Why do you think it's a little bit like Frankenstein?
I think because it's so juxtaposing, like it's so, like there's those really graphic scenes, but then there's also like really beautiful moments and quite calm and kind of like Tess as well, where they explain like the surroundings and stuff, and it gives you that reprieve, but it also, it's so disjointed, like that other thing, like that other article said, it is quite disjointed, and that makes me think of Frankenstein, like it's different pieces meshed together. But yeah, that's what I meant by a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah, I do see connections in terms of form, which you're mentioning with Frankenstein, but Frankenstein, the monster, the creation of Dr. Frankenstein, and we'll talk about the Gothic after we have a break in a moment. There's a similarity between Frankenstein's monster and Heathcliff in the sense that, and Camille mentioned this before, maybe I was kind of bloviating on about it on Monday. Frankenstein is a created monstrosity. Someone created him. Victor Frankenstein created this unethical dilemma that it can't reproduce. He's kind of a very tragic figure. He's grotesque and he's thrown upon the world. But nevertheless, part of the dilemma to the narrative of Frankenstein is Frankenstein, the monster, is actually a very good person. He's just hideous and grotesque to look at, and the world becomes horrified by him. Heathcliff, and I think you kind of mentioned it when you said it's a love story, but what is it also about, Amber?
Abuse and trauma.
So Heathcliff kind of becomes this monstrous Frankensteinian individual because kind of the trauma he suffers from multiple angles. Which brings me to another question that I'd like to ask, and you can answer it, Amber, or kind of we can throw it out to the class. Is there any justice to what Heathcliff does in the novel? Does it have a positive eventuality at all? I can actually hear the wind blowing kind of right out my window. It's almost a bit Gothic sounding. I'm not saying I hear the wind blowing because you guys all being silent. I can actually really hear the wind blowing. The answer, my friend, may be blowing in the wind. I don't know. I somewhat want to defend Heathcliff in a way, even though he hangs people's dogs, which I think no one should ever do, of course. Of course you shouldn't. He hits women, which of course you shouldn't do. He hits men, he hits boys, he hits children. Of course you shouldn't do all of that. But he does seem to be driven, and it's more a question about the causation of evil in a way. A lot of people often say, evil kind of can't have good consequences. But if you look at kind of nature, I'm not saying kind of certain aspects of nature are evil, but a lot of apex predators do kind of sustain an ecological environment through their predation that you don't really find. If you don't have, for instance, wolves lurking on the moors, you won't find kind of a developed ecology. Can good ever come out of evil? Getting a bit philosophical here.
I think so. I mean, maybe not for the person that's evil, but people can, I mean, the only connection I really have to this question is the musical Wicked, where the Wicked Witch has to leave because she's banished after she's, evil. But she ends up like falling in love, and people end up like being really happy afterwards. So maybe not for the evil person, but maybe for everyone around them, possibly.
Yeah, that's definitely one way of looking at it. Did anyone before did anyone identify with Heathcliff? Even though when we talked about Heathcliff being an antipath, aren't you kind of driven to identify with his oppression? And then when he returns, aren't you secretly, Heathcliff's back? Caitlin? Yeah, he's back, but he becomes really, really bad. But I kind of, after I read it multiple times, I do side with what Heathcliff does in terms of class. He's driven to kind of destroy the Grange, this institution of aristocratic kind of standing, of the idea that we're up here and you're down there. He takes that over and he just kind of abandons it and lets people rent it out if they so want. But he removes kind of that aspect of oppression. And then he does kind of set up this environment where Hurton kind of can mature. And this brings me to another question. Is Hurton better off left alone, or being, did Heathcliff help Hurton at all, as opposed to his father, his natural father, Hindley?
I definitely think in contrast to Hindley, he did. Like, Hindley did not a lot. And I don't think it's initially super apparent that, sorry, I've been pronouncing it Hareton, so that's right. But
no, I think maybe you're probably pronouncing it the correct way.
I don't know. But like initially he suffers quite a lot, but like he can look after himself, he can hunt, he can, do everything around the heights, and eventually he wins the heart of someone. So like he does turn out okay.
Yes. And I think when we're thinking about romance, but also romanticism, one of the things the Romantics really admired was this idea of the noble savage, which is a bit of a kind of, it's a very vexed issue, but the Romantics have this idea that children just need to be left alone. Let them run wild in nature and they'll discover their own morality. And we kind of see that a little bit with Hurton, who I think is the most admirable character. Like, he's probably one of my favorite characters in all of literature because he's so good and so oppressed simultaneously, and good does triumph in his case. Perhaps maybe not. Sorry, I feel like I was cutting someone off.
I was just gonna say, like, he was the only character I liked. Like, in the end, he just like really comes through.
Would anyone else like to read their mini review? I know it's pretty challenging to write one in 10 minutes, but I'm not expecting to publish it in the Sydney Morning Herald tomorrow. Go. A lot of alliteration going on there. That was great. An appetite for the dramatic. Did anyone struggle with the intense drama of this novel? The first time I read it, I certainly did. I'm thinking of those passages, particularly between Heathcliff and Cathy, when Cathy's about to die. They're very prolonged. I feel like often students will skip over them because it's, I cannot live without you, Cathy. Oh no. I don't want you. Get away from me. Leave me alone. It's very much Days of Our Lives type kind of stuff. but you know, what, 200 years before Days of Our Lives came about. I find after rereading it, the drama to be quite compelling. So you would definitely recommend it, Caitlin? Yes, yes. I do find it very funny. I find it much more funny, and I know this might sound perverse, than Pride and Prejudice. Why did you find it funny, Caitlin? Yeah. Um, the reason why I find it funny, and it goes to the violence. Some of the violence is depicted quite realistically, but a lot of the violence is a bit like a Nick Cave murder ballad song. It's just absurdly kind of vaudeville and comic. It's almost like something out of WWF. I remember a former student said, who didn't like the novel at all, but he said, I really like this scene because I'm a big wrestling fan. And he said, it just reminds me of the drama that you see in an action film or a wrestling film. There's, for instance, that scene where Hindley comes home drunk and he tries to get Hurton, and Nellie hides Hurton in the cupboard, and he kind of grabs Hurton out of the cupboard and he's trying to force Hurton to kiss him. And he's like, kiss me. And the baby's just screaming, trying to get away. And he's drunk and he's like got his bottle of wine and he carries Hurton up to the top of the stairs and he's going on and on and off. And then he hears something and he thinks it's Heathcliff. And then he drops the baby off the top of the stairs. And then lo and behold, Heathcliff comes along and catches the baby. But then Heathcliff thinks, oh, I wish I had have dashed that baby's brains out on the flagstones. The violence to a certain extent is so hyperbolic, so extreme, that I do think it's a little bit comic. It's a little bit like a Ren and Stimpy type kind of scenario where the violence is just so extreme. We have to wonder why Emily Bronte is even doing it, because I think there is kind of a lot of comedy there. Did anyone else kind of find certain aspects to Wuthering Heights to be kind of comic? I think Amber, you mentioned something.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what I was meaning by like dreamlike as well. Like it kind of feels like those really crazy dreams you wake up and you're like, whoa, like what did I just dream? That was the wildest thing. And how did my brain think of that? And some of those moments in her writing, it felt like maybe she dreamt it and she'd woken up and she'd written it, because it was just so absurd. And also the way that she's writing it makes it feel even more absurd. It's very like manic and frantic.
I definitely get that with the description of the interior of Wuthering Heights, the way they just disappear into one direction, like Joseph lives in the garret, and Hurton he just sleeps on some sacks somewhere, and then servants come in and out. And then it is very dreamlike in the sense that there's all these dogs moving about everywhere. There is this absurd kind of surrealist, almost proto-surrealist kind of comedy to the novel in that respect. I do think it often kind of gets viewed as not being funny at all, but I do think there's a lot of humor, particularly if any of you guys remember the scene where Catherine, X1, tries to force Heathcliff and Edgar to have a fight. Edgar's been told by Nellie that Heathcliff's hanging around the Grange, basically sleazing on to Isabella and sleazing on to his wife. Nellie says, it's time. You've got to get rid of Heathcliff because he's a bad influence. He's going to steal your sister and he's going to sleep with your wife. You've got to do something about this guy. And Edgar goes down there and he's like, you've got to get out of my house. And Heathcliff's like, this lamb threatens like a bull. What are you going to do about it? And then Edgar's like, I'm going to get my servants to beat you up while I kind of watch you from the top of my mansion. That's what I'm going to do. But Catherine she locks the door and throws the key in the fire and says, if you've got to fight for my love because this is a romance. And it's a bit of a joke because she's kind of parodying like that setup in traditional chivalric romances where the noble knights will have to fight to win the heart of the person they love. And of course, Edgar's not going to do it. He sits there like a leveret. I think he's described as a suckling leveret, a little baby rabbit. But then, does anyone know what happens? What does Edgar do when kind of Heathcliff's kind of glowering down at him going, you know, look at this peevish person? Kathleen?
Now he punches him, I think.
Yeah, he punches him in the neck and Heathcliff's like, oh, and then Edgar runs out. He runs out, he gives him a like punch, then runs out. And Heathcliff's like, do you expect me to go with this blow boiling in my gullet? Hell no. But he ends up going, of course, he ends up running off. So there is a whole lot of comedy in this novel if you kind of bring a certain lens to it. And I do think often we miss that because we get told that, hey, this is a really serious novel, and you kind of take your pen and paper out as you read it. But hopefully, Amber suggests read once, but I would definitely say come back to this in 10 years when you've kind of you've graduated from university and you're in your careers, because you'll probably find it much more enjoyable then. I think we might take a break for 10 minutes, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about the Gothic in Wuthering Heights, and we'll look at the Sublime, and we'll also look at the Byronic hero. And maybe start thinking about any Gothic kind of memories you have, but also think about any kind of Sublime experiences you may have, because yeah, we might have a discussion about what the Sublime is and what it means to us today, if it still exists, which I think it does. But let's have a 10-minute break because we've been going for an hour and a half, and it's good to stretch our legs. So it's 7:25, 10-minute break. Now, 7:25 plus 10 minutes, that must be 7:35. Yeah. I need to double check because, you know, I think a couple of sessions ago I got that wrong. Yeah, it's not good. My maths are getting worse and worse. I'm just going to grab a cup of tea, but if anyone has any questions when I get back, I'll jump in and answer them. Good, 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 good. I like your jumper. It's very floral, I think. Yeah, it's very bioluminescent. It kind of has a glowingness to it, the light blue and the dark blue. It actually, some of the leaves look like, what's that one plant that has its own solitary genus? Yucca or chukka or what's it called? It's a Chinese plant and it
I
has
think
its
you're right. I
own,
think it's yucca.
yucca. Yeah. Yeah, they grow really slowly, and they're very strange because they're genetically isolated. They're their own genus, and they only have one species in the genus. They're very, very kind of strange plants. Mm. Well, yeah, that's a really interesting question because they're so genetically removed. They're still a species, and there's probably chances for speciation in terms of subvariants. But at the moment, there's just one kind. If you go to the Royal Botanic Gardens, you can see them there. They're not bad. My mum's got one in her garden, and they just grow really, really slowly. I'm pretty sure they're originally from China, um, but yeah. Oh, well, 7:35. We're all tuning back in. Olivia's looking very goffed out there, very dark. You conducting a silence, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, the big lights are too bright for this time of night, so I've only got two lamps, so they're
No.
yeah. It's not
No,
as
it's
dark
suits-
in my room as what it looks on camera.
Yeah, no, it suits the mood because we're going to start talking about the Gothic in a moment.
That's great.
Um,
See my
yeah.
penguin jumper, you'd say otherwise.
Yeah. Well, hope there's no little voodoo doll of me that you're sticking pins in.
I actually have a voodoo doll. I actually have a voodoo doll. We got it from New Orleans.
Ooh,
Yeah.
and spooky.
I could go get it. I'll go get it.
It's a bit disturbing now. That's better. That's nicer. We'll get back underway in a moment, but we've got a little bit more to cover on the Gothic. Actually, once upon a time, I kind of turned down a job teaching the Gothic because, well, it's kind of an area that it's a very big topic. So kind of it's what can we cover in the limited time we've got. And I think also some of you that kind of are a bit kind of peeved that we're not getting through enough stuff. One thing I can say in defense is it's just a very brief unit. If you're really, really interested in the novels, reach out and join a society like the Jane Austen Society, the Bronte Society. I think there's two in Australia. There's definitely one in Sydney, and they could do with some young people joining it because they're all Josephs basically. They're all very old, grumbling kind of retirees, and those societies could do with some rejuvenation, but also think about continuing to study kind of literature, kind of postgraduate wise or honors wise. Kind of, I always feel like teaching romance and realism is kind of tragic in a month because there's so much more to the literature than we have time to cover. Are you going to show us this voodoo doll before we get back underway, Olivia?
Yeah. Okay, so it comes in a little coffin.
Ah, do
And he looks like that. He's got like a little cigar and everything. Sugar skull. Oh,
Are you talking about Papa Legba?
I don't know who it is. Yeah, and he's got like the pins in him. So he's got yellow for success, white for positive, red power, purple spirituality, green money, blue love, and black negative. So we haven't touched any of those though.
Ah, good. I often get a little concerned when someone pulls out a voodoo doll. In my last unit I taught, someone had an effigy of Satan in the background, and kind of I was a bit concerned for any Christian students. And I should say that Olivia's not a witch. You're not a witch, are you, Olivia? You're just being very playful. That's not a real voodoo doll. No one's doing supernatural witchcraft.
Oh,
here. No, it's just
It's
a bit
just
of
on our
fun.
shelf.
Yeah. No, I do think with the effigy of Satan as well, that was just a bit of fun as well. So there was nothing to be concerned about there at all. I might get the ball rolling, and hopefully you can hang on to that, Olivia, because I am going to ask you guys to kind of discuss where you see the Gothic in your lives in a short moment. I do want to apologize as well. I also just remembered after I kind of asked a lot of questions, I didn't really ask everyone if they wanted to read their review. I think in Collaborate, there may be a place you can upload your reviews if you'd like to do it, and I'll check them out and kind of have a look at them, and maybe we can all do that. I think the in-class activities will have a page where you can upload them. Yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't kind of select everyone or ask everyone, or if you're a little kind of, I do feel like some people are very modest and they lurk, and that can be good, but sometimes life demands that you can't. Right. Let's get into looking at the Gothic. I'm sure you've all heard of this thing called the Gothic. Now it kind of behoves me to kind of explain and contextualize what we kind of mean when we're talking about the Gothic in Victorian fiction. And I've got a general contention here, because what I want to do is try to explain to you what I think the Gothic was for Bronte and what it was for the period in which she was writing, and connect that to why I don't think people liked her novels so much during the period, because Gothic literature was very, very popular during the 19th century. People loved the ghost story, people loved Gothic aesthetics and Gothic narratives, but Gothic literature was supposed to follow certain conventions. I might ask generally, does anyone know what Jane Austen thought about the Gothic? I think, Sarisha, you mentioned it in your analysis. Sorry to call you out, but you kind of alluded to it a little bit. Was Jane Austen a fan of the Gothic? Did she write Gothic novels herself?
Yes, somewhat.
Somewhat, Soleil.
Yes.
Which novels of hers would you say are Gothic?
Northanger Abbey.
Northanger Abbey is about the Gothic, but
Yes.
is it kind of a spoof or a bit of a joke about Gothic literature?
Yes, which is why I said somewhat.
Yeah, that's kind of, I was a little worried because I thought you were going to say it's a Gothic novel, and I was going to have to say, well, no, it's kind of a joke about Gothic literature, and then you'd be like, no, it's actually a Gothic novel. No, so yeah, Soleil mentions a novel by Jane Austen called Northanger Abbey, which was published after her death. It's a very short novel. It's very readable. It starts in Bath, and then it goes to this abbey, which the protagonist, female heroine, thinks is going to be haunted by ghosts. But it's very drab and very realistic. If I ever had a choice for changing Pride and Prejudice, which I probably wouldn't do because Northanger Abbey isn't such a great novel in terms of kind of the romance novel, I would use Northanger Abbey because it does kind of poke fun at all the conventions we find in Gothic literature. But I want to kind of transition from looking at those reviews to kind of looking at the Gothic and developing an argument as to why perhaps people didn't like Wuthering Heights in terms of how it used the Gothic. So what I think those reviews speak to is the idea that Wuthering Heights violated a number of established Victorian values, particularly the sanctity placed on the home and the family, particularly a space in which domesticated femininity evinced cultural civility. If you look at, for instance, Isabella Heathcliff, after she marries Heathcliff, and when she appears at Wuthering Heights, this whole idea of the home as a utopia collapses because Wuthering Heights is this Gothic kind of chaotic place, whereas in most Victorian fiction, in most 19th century fiction, places like Longbourn, but also places like Pemberley, which is framed as a kind of utopia, were meant to be this place in which women could kind of control and in which civility and civilization kind of reign supreme. You don't get that in Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights also, however, violated a number of generic conventions present within the novel, namely the demand that a novel avoid fragmented states of narrative subjectivity, productive of moral ambiguity, and furthermore, the demand that modern novels clearly discern between romance and realism rather than confuse the two. So, as we talked about on Monday, Wuthering Heights is told from fragmented perspectives. So we all get like a broken glass view of the world as we see it. We do get a very realistic depiction of the world, but it's very fragmented and morally ambiguous, whereas the Victorians in particular really liked moral clarity. And we'll see this to a certain extent when we look at Tess of the D'Urbervilles. The Victorians hated that novel in a similar way to the reason why they hated Wuthering Heights, but nonetheless, the reason why they hated it is because Thomas Hardy was so very severe on the patriarchal standards that were going on at the time that they just felt morally repulsed by the truth. So Wuthering Heights violated a number of established conventions. Above all, Wuthering Heights' unconventional deployment of the Gothic and sublime, particularly her celebration or valorization, her uplifting of the violence of wild nature over a species of ordered tameness embodied in the pet, undermined Victorian society's belief in progress by foregrounding the idea that power has no real association with either justice or morality. So what I'm getting at there, and what we'll look at when we turn to the Gothic, is this idea that we live in a just and moral universe, as opposed to the reality, perhaps, that we live in a state of nature in which power is just there. Power and violence kind of are these necessities that we find in the environment. Emily Bronte doesn't shy away from this, and this kind of powers some of the Gothic elements of her novels. Bronte, furthermore, seems to use the Gothic to problematize patriarchy rather than induce states of terror and mystery capable of clever narrative rationalization. What I mean by this is, Bronte seems to connect certain Gothic forms of representation, particularly to do with violence against women, for example, but also violence against children, to representations of patriarchy, particularly Heathcliff here. Heathcliff is the main protagonist, but also the main patriarch in the novel. He's also very much a Gothic villain. In a lot of traditional Gothic romances and Gothic novels, you would have similar forms of terror and mystery, but they would be kind of externalized in the form of metaphysical agents or ghosts and goblins coming in, whereas Emily Bronte seems to have projected the Gothic onto a real social villain, a real patriarchal problem. And it doesn't really get rationalized at the end. Patriarchy is just this thing that exists, it goes on. We stare down at his death, but it's probably going to continue. Added to this, and perhaps more kind of problematic of all, I think I've talked a bit about this on Monday, is the novel is really fueled by antipathy as opposed to sympathy towards humanity. Emily Bronte, I mean, there's room for argument here because there is a bit of love at the end of the novel. She did have a bit of a cynical, somewhat misanthropic view of the world. Let's talk a little bit about Wuthering Heights as a Gothic romance. This term, the Gothic, kind of goes way back. We could probably go back to a Germanic tribe that invaded Western Europe kind of when the Roman Empire was starting to fall apart. We could go way back to kind of that Germanic tribe. But where I want to begin by talking about the Gothic is as an artistic term that emerged in the 17th and 18th century in a pejorative sense, in a negative sense, as a derogatory kind of slur word that was used basically to label something. Initially, it was architecture as somewhat savage, asymmetrical, barbarous, and medieval. So you had these Roman Gothic barbarous people that kind of destroyed or helped destroy or plague Rome in the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Eras. But what also emerged in the medieval period was a thing called Gothic architecture, which I quite like and quite think is exceptionally beautiful. But remember when we talked about neoclassicism, being very rational and symmetrical and well ordered, in the 17th and 18th century, when people look back to the classical period as this halcyon day of order and structure and perfection, they tended to look back to the Gothic period. We're talking about maybe from the 10th to the 14th century, when Gothic architecture was really kind of at work in Western Europe. They looked back at that architecture and said, oh, that's very barbarous, that's very primitive architecture. We don't really like it because it's dark, it's grim, it's got kind of all types of grotesque structures to it, so we're not really going to deal with that. So there's that one kind of historical definition of the Gothic, but the term Gothic, as we're talking about it in literature, although a lot of Gothic architecture is tied to the literature, refers to what you would call a cluster, a whole kind of group of generic conventions or tropes associated firstly with Romanticism, an inordinate fondness for supernatural phenomena. And I think supernatural phenomena and Romanticism and the Gothic are all tied together, because Romanticism in one way was about challenging reason and suggesting that there may be kind of higher states of being beyond what we can detect through our senses. A lot of focus on the night and darkness, narrowness, the grotesque, things that appear somewhat ugly. And I think you do see a lot of that in Wuthering Heights. I do think there's often a contrast between a beautiful girl like Catherine and a somewhat grotesque figure like Heathcliff, who does become even more grotesque towards the end of the novel. There is a scene when Nally, for instance, spots him in the dark, and he just looks hideously ugly, but also hideously needful. The Gothic's also interested in social outcasts, gypsies, graveyards is a central setting for a lot of Gothic narratives, architectural ruins, things that have fallen apart but may be inhabited by kind of mysterious figures, sublime, and we'll look at the sublime in a moment, and very inhospitable places, a bit like the moors in Wuthering Heights. The moors are beautiful, but they're also exceptionally dangerous. And you see that with Lockwood, of course, because he has to get trapped. He gets trapped at Wuthering Heights because the snowstorm comes in and he can't walk home because he might fall into an early grave. The Gothic's also interested in asymmetrical structures. Mystery is very central to the Gothic, and a general hostility towards the process of modernization. So one of the big kind of ideological things, if we think about what the Gothic might do, and the reason why it's so dark and disturbing, is it does question the idea that we're actually progressing, and it does kind of look back to the medieval period, to the Dark Ages, as perhaps a time when there was certain aspects that were a little more beautiful and a bit more humane compared to the industrial modernized world. I think another really thing to think about if you're thinking about writing about the Gothic in your essays is the Gothic and Romance were very much tied together, because the Gothic looked back, of course, it looked back to medieval architecture, to kind of a time before modernization, before industrialization. And of course, the medieval period was the period in which we find those early romances, those early chivalric tales of kind of knights and damsels in distress who, of course, have to go and save Rapunzel from the top of a castle. Although I do think Rapunzel saves herself because she's got that long hair. So the Gothic is very much connected to romance. We need to talk about the Gothic because we're looking at Wuthering Heights, of course. Some questions you should ask, particularly if you're thinking about writing about the Gothic, is what is its general purpose? Is it simply just some aesthetic preference that Emily Bronte, for example, uses? And I will mention there are some slight Gothic moments in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. They're hard to spot. No, you will spot them. They're often very repulsive and abject moments, but there are some Gothic kind of flavors in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Is it just aesthetics? Is it just a style? Do you just put on black and kind of put some makeup on and say I'm a goth and that's kind of all it is? Or does it kind of have a broader function? And Amber mentioned that she thought that the novel Wuthering Heights was about love, but it was also about a lot of psychological trauma. And one thing we might like to ask about the Gothic is the Gothic coming into play in Wuthering Heights, perhaps to represent, sublimate? Sublimate means to kind of conceal or kind of cover over or personify. Is it used to represent or exaggerate repressed psychological and oppressive social problems, traumas, issues like, for instance, child abuse? We've got Hurton here looking very sad, and he's kind of left in the clutches of Heathcliff. So do think about kind of, if you're writing about the Gothic, is it just an aesthetic kind of way of representing the world, or is that aesthetic kind of preference and the use of certain Gothic themes, which we'll look at in a moment, tied to representing broader kind of themes within the novel? And a further question you might want to ask, of course, is why has Bronte chosen to use a certain Gothic theme to cover up or represent a social problem perhaps the society at the time doesn't want to deal with? Is Gothic being used in that sense as a mask? So let's talk a little bit more about kind of how Gothic narratives might differ from, for instance, the narrative we saw with Pride and Prejudice. Some Gothic narratives, not all, tend to be driven by a lack of epistemic closure. What I mean by that is, at the end of Pride and Prejudice, of course, everything gets resolved. Everything fits orderly into its place. A lot of Gothic narratives often leave a lot open to the reader. For instance, at the end of Wuthering Heights, we're kind of staring at some wonderfully portrayed gravestones, a beautiful scene to close a novel, but we're just kind of wondering, is this it? Is this the end? Is this how all love ends at a graveyard? Gothic narratives also tend to look back or bring dead historical periods back to life. So instead of looking progressively forward, a lot of Gothic literature is set way back in the past. And I'll give you an example in a moment, but if anyone thinks of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, that of course was written in the 19th century, but set in the medieval period. Gothic is very much fascinated with mystery. And I do think Heathcliff is quintessentially Gothic in this sense, because we don't know where he comes from at the very beginning of the novel. And in book 2, we don't really know where he gets his economic power. We don't really know what his ethnicity is. We don't kind of know whether he's good or completely bad. He's very ambiguous. He's very, very mysterious. And I do think part of the romance of Heathcliff, kind of before all the toxicity sets in, is this mystery. And even with Darcy, although Darcy is not a very much a romantic figure, he's nonetheless, he has a certain mystery to him. So the Gothic does looks back to kind of not so much prehistorical periods, but dead periods, and attempts to bring them to light. Central to Victorian modernity as well was this assumption that women were essentially domestic creatures. Do we see that in Wuthering Heights? Is domesticity a great thing? Does it help Catherine out, Catherine I? Is she happy with her domestic life after she marries Edgar Linton?
She's not happy. She mentioned that thing. I just stuck in 4 walls. I feel like I will be a child, so I can run the walls as free as I can. So she's not happy about it.
No, she isn't. And part of her psychosis is the fact that she's basically locked up in the Grange, and she can't really go anywhere. There's also a wonderful passage before Kathy passes where she predicts her the future, which is also very Gothic. Time seems to collapse in that passage where Kathy tears up the pillows and she's counting the different types of birds that make up her pillows. But she is very much trapped at the Grange. She's trapped in kind of all spaces. You definitely see the Gothic coming into play with Isabella Linton, where kind of Heathcliff is basically abusing her in a very horrible way. So the home isn't isn't a wonderful place in Wuthering Heights. It's kind of very much like a Gothic dungeon. Did we kind of think that Wuthering Heights, the building itself, was somewhat Gothic in terms of what type of architecture was it? Would you like to live at Wuthering Heights? Sarisha's shaking her head. Anyone else though? Like, I kind of wouldn't mind it. It would be better than this little flat. But I'm living next to there's like a little bit over that way, and there's someone drying their clothes. Like there's a washing machine department, and I can hear it through my wall. I guess it would be better than Joseph, like reading the Bible, and Hurton kind of laying with beasts. Would anyone like kind of to live at the Heights, or is that just, you know, too extreme? Oh, it comes with Kathy, yeah. Think about it. It is a bit of a Gothic edifice. It's very labyrinthine. It's very hard to depict Wuthering Heights if you wanted to create a blueprint of it, because it's very vaguely sketched out. It's very much a maze. You see that when Isabella Linton goes there. But if you read the novel from the very beginning, Lockwood describes it as this kind of edifice with Gothic elements. Happy, the architect, had foresight to build it strong. The narrow windows are deeply set in the wall, and the corners defended with large jutting stones. The corners defended. It's almost a fortified structure. Before passing the threshold, I paused to admire a quantity of grotesque carving lavished over the front, and especially about the principal door, above which, among a wilderness of crumbling griffins and shameless little boys, I detected the date 1500. So you definitely have Gothic elements coming in to portray the Heights as this dark little Gothic space. I also find it's interesting that you have these shameless little boys, probably cupids, but everything's broken and falling apart. It's a very defensive edifice. It's not open and welcoming. If you were to contrast this environment to the representation of the Grange, for example, when Heathcliff talks about his journey to the Grange, it's full of sweetness and light. Everything is open and warm and welcoming. So there's definitely a lot of Gothic going on in representations of the Heights. In terms of architecture here, I did mention the Hunchback of Notre Dame. We kind of all somewhat familiar with the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I remember there was a huge Disney thing on it when I was a kid, but maybe you guys missed that. So we've got a picture from the Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's actually quite sad. Camille's got her thumbs up there. What actually, does anyone remember where? Well, sorry, it's in the title. Where is the Hunchback of Notre Dame set?
Notre Dame.
Yeah, Notre Dame. It's a bit sad because Notre Dame recently burnt down, didn't it?
Yeah, it's in France. There's a movie coming out about it, actually.
Yeah, well, that would be quite a beautiful film to watch because it is a beautiful structure. I went there once and walked around, had a creme brulee across the road and did the stupid tourist who goes to France thing. Definitely worth going. I just watch out for people on bikes because they don't really care. They don't wear helmets and they just ride everywhere. In this little scene, you kind of see Quasimodo, the little Gothic hunchback monster who you can fall in love with because he's a bit like Hurton in a way. He's very simple and innocent and childish, but disfigured by the world, a bit like the Gothic architecture itself. Here we have another scene of terror from a book by Matthew Lewis called The Monk. Has anyone heard of this novel? Kind of doesn't get read as much as it should, but The Monk kind of, it's very much a Gothic romance set in the medieval period about these monks who are very sexually repressed. The reason why I show you this image, not because I think it's a fantastic cartoon, although I think it's terribly bad, but when you think about the Gothic and maybe Gothic sexualities are here you see a scene of sexual violence occurring in a dungeon, but definitely there's a lot of association here, perhaps with a bit of phallic imagery, kind of a bit of kind of sordid passion. You might want to kind of thinking about the Gothic not just being aesthetic, think about when you read Gothic passages in Wuthering Heights and a little bit in Tess as perhaps conveying issues to do with sexual repression in the case of this image, rather than just kind of strange dungeon depictions. I want to ask a question now. We've been talking about Gothic aesthetics, Gothic kind of structures. Do you guys know of any Gothic spaces? Would you describe Melbourne as a Gothic space?
Is NGV a little bit Gothic?
Peter's Church is.
NGV a little Gothic. I guess it can be a little bit. It's very brutalist. It's very flat. I always try and get money out of those fountains. That was the whole idea of the excursion. So I was going to get you all to jump in there and get money for me, and then we'd go home wet. What did you say, Ryan? You're thinking of some churches, perhaps?
Yeah, I said St. Peter's Church.
Oh, yeah. St. Peter's, St. Patrick's. Has anyone been to St. Patrick's? It's definitely Gothic when you think about Cardinal Pell. Like it's definitely dark and disturbing in that respect. That's very.
It's even got the gargoyles and the grotesque on it.
Yeah, I think one of them is of Jeff Kennett. If anyone remembers Jeff Kennett, like our former premier, he's got a gargoyle of Jeff Kennett. Yeah, very neo-Gothic architecture. A lot of it was kind of designed by a famous Victorian architect called Augustus Pugin, who kind of built a lot of Gothic buildings or designed a lot of Gothic buildings for the early colonial environment in Australia. Has anyone been to the ANZ Gothic Bank? Sarisha's shaking her head. Has anyone heard of the ANZ Gothic Bank? I'd recommend you guys Google it. It's been voted the most beautiful building in Melbourne time after again. It's got a ceiling of gold, and it's like a Gothic church, but it's a bank. It's very beautiful. It's very Gothic. It's definitely worth seeing. It's on the Elizabeth Street side of Collins Street in Melbourne. You can go in and walk around, and if you're a part of ANZ Bank, which I'm not, I don't really like ANZ Bank, you can go and take some money out and take it out in Gothic fashion. It's definitely worth seeing. It's quite a beautiful Gothic building. Are there any Gothic animals in Melbourne? The bats. The bats. The bats come out at night, and it makes the city very, very Gothic. It makes the city very, very beautiful. Bats are, of course, black. They're often associated with Dracula, and you see them all throughout the city at night, kind of looking very Gothic. I might kind of throw it open to discussion. Does anyone kind of think of any other spaces around where they live that are kind of a bit spooky?
I guess I live near like a place that does like ghost tours and stuff.
Oh, really?
So yeah, it's also near like a sea dock as well. So that can be a bit like creepy if you ever go down there and look out during the night.
Yes.
You can see the city, so it's not that scary, but yeah, it's still a bit freaky because they do ghost tours and stuff around there.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Particularly, imagine a ghost appearing near the lighthouse. Lighthouses are often associated with ghostly kind of apparitions. Are there any, we're thinking back, but is there any way of thinking about perhaps modern places that are quite Gothic? I always find KFC to be very Gothic, particularly on a dark night when I like walk past and I see a family of 7 in there eating out of a KFC chicken bucket, and they're all looking very Gothic and kind of disturbing. I'm getting at the like Emily Bronte comic Gothic here. You know, the Gothic can be to a certain extent our own kind of perverse perspectives into the world. I find train stations, some of them very kind of dangerously Gothic, like spooky. I wouldn't want to kind of, you know, get off the Werribee train at 1 a.m. Yeah, I do think there are a lot of kind of spooky Gothic places around. Abandoned hospitals in Melbourne. I'm surprised you guys must. India.
Definitely Frankston.
Frankston. very Dickensian Gothic in a way. My grandmother lives in Frankston, but she always emphasizes that she lives in Frankston South. Somehow the South makes Frankston, I actually think Frankston's great in many ways. Why is Frankston kind of Gothic?
It's scary.
It's scary. It can be confronting at times.
It's the same as when people say they live in Melton, but they say they don't live in Melton South because that's the bad area.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think there is a postmodern or a modern Gothic, and I definitely think there's an Australian Gothic. Has anyone been out into the countryside and thought this is a bit spooky? I remember once I had an Asian friend, and we went out to a pub in the country, and because he was Asian, like, it became a big thing. Everyone just stopped and they looked at him very creepily, and they looked at me very creepily, and we basically had to leave. It was disturbing in the sense that there were all dead animals on the walls, because it was a hunting pub, obviously. So it was a bit like, you ain't from around here, a bit of the beginning of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, perhaps. Country areas, particularly remote ones, can often have a bit of a spooky element to them. I think I don't want to kind of point out kind of too tediously certain elements of the Gothic, but there are a lot of ghosts, for instance, in Wuthering Heights. Is Heathcliff referred to as a vampire at one stage of the novel? I think he's referred to as a vampire, succubi, those little sexual demons that live on people when they go to sleep, witches, religious crazies. That's probably a euphemism for Joseph. People that kind of suspend or transgress the natural laws of the world. Are there witches in Wuthering Heights? Do certain people get accused of witchcraft?
Doesn't Catherine Jr. get accused of that at the start?
Yeah, and she plays up to it. Joseph's like, hearken, she's cursing on him. And then he's like, she's witched our lad. He uses witch as a verb, which is quite interesting in a way. Joseph's going around pretty much, he accuses all women of being witches. He accuses Nellie of being a witch. Femininity and witchcraft go kind of hand in hand because Joseph's so pious and biblical. So there's a whole lot of assumed witchcraft going on in Wuthering Heights. Once again, you probably want to think about perhaps the relationship, not just the literal idea that there are witches, but maybe it's something to do with Catherine's feminism, her ideological stances on the world that gets her represented as a witch. Often I do think there's a lot of kind of sublimation going on. The Gothic's not just existing for no reason. Another aspects to the Gothic, which we see in Wuthering Heights, are graveyards, nocturnal deeds and melancholy. Where's Heathcliff always hanging out? Where does he go at night? It's somewhat romantic as well, I have to say. Like, if I was to die and I had a lover, I would like them to visit me in the graveyard at night. Does Heathcliff take it a little bit further?
Yeah, a little.
I sense a certain sarcasm in your little. What does he do, Camille?
I think he digs up Catherine, and I think he kind of has it in his head that he's going to like put himself down there at some point and sort of kick Linton out a little bit.
Yeah, he does. Very central to like the Gothic and graveyards, of course, is necromancy. And if you take it one step further, perhaps with Heathcliff, and you've got necrophilia. I think Heathcliff kind of tries to embrace Kathy, and it doesn't quite work out. But he's down. Heathcliff's down for digging up a grave and kind of getting it on with his dead lover. This is very Gothic. It's very disturbing. Kind of a key aspect. Once again, don't think about it literally. Perhaps something's going on here about grief, profound grief, perhaps. I do love a bit of necromancy and a bit of Heathcliff hanging out at the graveyard. Let's talk a little bit about the Sublime, because the Sublime is kind of connected to the Gothic in a very kind of central fashion. I might ask before I kind of give my take on the Sublime as it relates to the Gothic. Do we use the term sublime today as meaning a good thing? Camille's got thumbs up. Does anyone ever have really good food and they go, oh, that was sublime? Soleil. Yeah, the Sublime kind of, I think there is an ice cream called the Sublime. Ice cream's pretty sublime. It's very, very good. And I do think if you open up your Oxford English Dictionary, some of the modern definitions of the Sublime will be this idea of something very, very good. If we take it to put the Sublime in the context of the Gothic, it refers more to a delight, but more an experience that we get of a visceral experience, a feeling, a kind of the hairs raising on your neck. The sense of terror that we derive from the representation of objects, animals, environments that can cause extreme pain and death. Is anyone afraid of spiders? No, Sarisha, you're like, I don't mind spiders. If a huntsman jumped through your back window, you'd be fine. Jumped on your head and kind of crawled around.
I haven't seen that, but just the normal spiders, I'm okay with it. I won't kill them.
Is anyone afraid of snakes?
Yeah, I hate them.
Yeah, I have a brother who's terrified of snakes, and I'm not terrified of them, so I always hold that over him. India, are you terrified of anything?
I mean, like, I'm not scared of spiders. Like, if I see them in the corner, I'm like, okay, you chill there. That's fine. I'm not going to bother you. You're just living your life. But, like, if I'm laying in bed, and I've had this happen a few times, and I just see something like crawl across my pillow, nah, you're dead. Sorry. Like, you're in my space. Snakes and stuff, I like snakes. I can hold them. I wouldn't go out and grab one out of the yard and pick it up. But, yeah, I can hold them if they're, like, in a zoo or something.
What about sharks? I'm terrified of sharks, absolutely terrified. They scare me. They scare me so very much. I can't swim. I can't go in the water. I go to the beach and I just look at the beautiful water and, you know, I think they're all going to get eaten. A shark's going to come along.
Yeah, I find that interesting because sharks only eat at dusk and dawn.
Yes, at dusk and dawn, which is a bit Gothic as well. You know, they're a bit like vampires in a way. They kind of, you know, they're out in the morning and only out at night. So maybe there's an association there. What I'm getting at asking you about kind of perhaps phobias, but also terrors you have. The Sublime kind of, in one sense, it does relate to a pleasurable feeling. But the Sublime, as it relates to the Gothic and ideas about terror and darkness, kind of relates to our ability to receive pleasure from terror, particularly from objects, animals, and things that can kind of actually cause extreme pain and death. This version of the Sublime, and I mentioned it's just one version, was first conceptualized by an Irish Anglo philosopher called Edmund Burke in an essay called A Philosophical Inquiry into Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful in the middle of the 18th century. I think the title's a lot longer than that. I've shortened it for the sake of this here. What Burke tried to do, Burke was a very conservative figure in the history of Romanticism, but he was also kind of very central in kind of how he came up with ideas to do with aesthetics. He had this idea that the sublime and beauty are two different things. On the one hand, you have this thing called beauty, and on the other hand, you have this thing called the sublime. Asymmetrical, ugly, or grotesque things that provoke horror and disgust were considered to be sublime. Things that terrify were sublime. They created a sublime, terrifying feeling, whereas things that were kind of soft and harmonious and symmetrical and pillow cushions and rose petals, things that smelt nice, they were what Burke called the beautiful. So when Burke came up with this theory of the sublime, he did create a highly binary kind of way of distinguishing the sublime from the beautiful. And it was very gendered as well, because often he'd say women have more supple and soft skin, whereas men are like the exoskeletons of insects. They're very hard and rugged and fierce. And I do think you kind of see Emily Bronte playing into this when it comes to Heathcliff. Heathcliff is a very rugged figure. Rugged masculinity certainly gets romanticized and almost rendered sublime in Wuthering Heights. So reason why I'm harping on about this is because the theory of the sublime is a little perplexing to some, because we have this idea of the sublime being good. Burke writes in his essay on the sublime, whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and anger. Note here, excite the ideas, not actually create pain and anger, danger. That is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible, or is conversant about terrible objects, or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. The strongest emotion, Burke is essentially saying that fear and terror is greater than love. I say the strongest emotion because I am satisfied the ideas of pain are much more powerful than those which enter on the part of pleasure. But as pain is stronger in its operation than pleasure, so death is in general a much more affecting idea than pain. Because there are very few pains, however exquisite, which are not preferred to death, nay, what generally makes pain itself, if I may say so, more painful is that it is considered as an emissary of this king of terrors. When danger or pain press too nearly, they are incapable of giving any delight and are simply terrible. But at certain distances and with certain modifications, they may be and they are delightful, as we every day experience. The cause of this I shall endeavour to investigate hereafter. So what Burke's getting at is we don't actually delight in ourselves experiencing pain or terror, but experiencing the delight of the possibility of that terror embodied in kind of something external to ourselves. Is this a little unethical to suggest that we actually take pleasure in seeing pain, in seeing terror? And is it true? Do we delight in seeing things which, so far from doing, our heartiest wishes would like to see redressed? I'm thinking about Hollywood here and what powers Hollywood. Also, perhaps because we're talking about Wuthering Heights and the Gothic, what I've been suggesting powers Wuthering Heights. As I mentioned, it's an incredibly violent novel, but you kind of can't take your eyes away from it. Is Burke kind of right here? Do we delight in seeing things which, so far from doing, we kind of actually would ethically wish to see redressed?
I think so. I mean, it's kind of like those like prank videos, or when you watch a video of like someone falling over or something, like a lot of people find those pretty entertaining and like start to giggle or whatever. So I guess maybe.
That's a good starting point, Olivia, and I might extend that there by saying, does anyone watch Air Crash Investigations while eating popcorn? Does anyone kind of watch Air Crash Investigations? Anyone know of Air Crash Investigations?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I definitely watch a lot of true crime while like eating my breakfast and dinner.
True crime, well, it helps the digestion perhaps. Yeah, I find true crime to be kind of, all of these mentions kind of, a lot of horror films, right? Horror films kind of function on terror. We like the idea of being thrilled and terrorized by mystery and the possibility of horror. I actually went through a period while I was writing my PhD when the only way I could get to sleep was by putting Air Crash Investigations on. It was like the nursery rhyme of the nightmare of my dissertation. I don't know why, but it helped me get to sleep. And I think it's a bit like rain falling on the roof. You know, you like the sound of rain falling on the roof, it makes you feel comfortable. I do think in a way, I didn't really delight in Air Crash Investigations, but I kind of felt like I feel really safe and something horrible is happening outside, and I'm going to go to sleep because kind of I got over that stage. But anyone seen the film Jaws? Like, you're watching people get eaten. It's kind of it's very central to Western aesthetics, and it's very unethical. And this kind of ties into this question of what realism actually does in terms of representing the world ethically and kind of identifying social problems. And those of you who have started thinking about Tess of the D'Urbervilles, do pay attention to the way Hardy aestheticizes Tessa's oppression and the suffering she goes through, because it's very unethical, but there is this aesthetic dimension to it. If we had went to the NGV, I would have shown you this painting by a painter called George Stubbs. It looks like an absolute really ridiculous painting today, but people used to hang this in their lounge room in the 19th century, and they used to look at it. It's an absurd kind of scenario, but they used to think, whoa, that horse is in a lot of trouble, and look at that big cat on that horse. Very kind of affluent British people who read things like Wuthering Heights, they really took delight in these kind of scenes of wild nature kind of ripping into this poor horse. Sorry about the shark, if anyone's sharkophobic. Can anyone think of any sublime experiences?
Skydiving or bungee jumping?
Yeah, skydiving, bungee jumping. Did anyone see the recent Everest film? I don't know if it's too recent. I think Steven Spielberg made it. Does anyone kind of go mountaineering? I don't know if anyone does, but does anyone do anything that they just do because it kind of is exhilarating?
I went on an ATV like last year, and I feared for my life. But
what's an ATV?
An all-terrain vehicle.
Oh, yes.
And it was the scariest experience of my whole life, but everyone else had fun.
Yeah. I have a very disturbing story about those all-terrain vehicles, maybe for after class. But I'm surprised you guys aren't thrill seekers.
I just thought of one. It's not so much recent, but did anyone else as like a kid growing up used to like chant Bloody Mary in the mirror? Like, and it was like the adrenaline of like, it was the fear of like what was going to happen that was just so like exhilarating.
Even now, I walk past the mirror and sometimes I think, oh, don't say it. Don't say it. What if she pops up in the mirror? Oh my God. As a kid, every time. And now I'm terrified of the mirror.
Yeah.
At night, I would walk past the mirror and be like, don't look at me.
I know.
Bloody Mary.
How funny. Oh my God.
Looks like this as well. Like under the mirror, like,
Yes, with the candles and stuff. Oh my God.
I don't even know what the context of that is. Like, why do you do it?
Pretty much there was like this little story that went around when, I don't know, it must have been our age group when we were younger. And like you would stare in the mirror and you would say Bloody Mary 3 times in the mirror and she would like pop up and she'd be like bleeding from the eyes and like choking, like all that kind of stuff. It was freaky. But, you know, it was just a story, but we always used to do it as so weird.
That's definitely somewhat sublime. Yeah, I would add that to the bucket list of sublime things to do. Mirrors do kind of frequent Gothic literature. I was thinking about that film, The Ring. Did anyone remember seeing The Ring? That's a very terrifying film. That's a very spooky film. I don't know. India's laughing. Is it actually not too terrifying?
I don't know. I can't do scary movies. I can't. They freak me out. I watched Paranormal Activity in the cinema and I wanted to cry. So yeah.
Mm. It sounds like quite an experience. Sounds gothic. All right, cool, cool. In terms of the sublime in Wuthering Heights, if you are looking at the Gothic in Wuthering Heights for your essay, do consider perhaps the question of where you can see the sublime in terms of kind of the representation of disturbing or terrifying kind of creatures. Kind of often Heathcliff will kind of invoke the sublime. So when he stares at Isabella, he doesn't just look at her with hostility. He looks at her as one might do at a strange, repulsive animal, a centipede from the Indies, for instance, which curiosity leads one to examine in spite of the aversion it raises. Do you kind of remember that feeling when you were a child and you upturned a rock and you saw all these little creatures, like that perverse, disturbing experience? Look at all the animalistic representations. They're often very sublime in nature. Kind of Isabella's terrified kind of Heathcliff. He's often represented as like worse than a tiger or a venomous serpent. Heathcliff at one stage, when Cathy II tries to hug him, he says, "I'd rather be hugged by a snake." Can a snake hug you? I guess it can in a way. Yeah, I do think it's a very weird kind of analogy or metaphor. Something to consider is whether Heathcliff is set up to embody the sublime. I've got a whole lot of passages here from Wuthering Heights where you do actually see a lot of the sublime kind of being invoked. You definitely get it in Wuthering Heights, whereas at the Grange, it's very much kind of stable, gendered, civilized, domesticated space. But most of it breaks out and becomes very violent when you come to look at the representation of Wuthering Heights. In the time I've got remaining, I thought it would be good to say something about the Byronic hero, which I think is tied to the representation of Heathcliff quite significantly. Does anyone know or heard or much about Lord Byron, the famous Romantic poet? Apparently he was quite a looker. No one's kind of heard of Lord Byron? He was kind of a very popular sex symbol in the early Romantic period, the 19th century. I don't know, is he an attractive man? He kind of looks like Josh Frydenberg. I know we've just had the budget, but I always find Lord Byron looks a bit like Joshua Frydenberg. Perhaps I'm kind of going into it. The reason why I mentioned it is because we've looked at Darcy, and Darcy did come to embody this modern idea of hegemonic masculinity, the gentleman, the perfect gentleman, well-spoken, well-bred, respectful of women, ready to tell the truth and be honorable at all times. A significant contrast during this period was Lord Byron, who was known as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He was kind of a bit of a misanthropist, not unlike Emily Bronte. There is a bit of aristocratic element to Emily Bronte. She definitely does feel like she's a bit above society. But the Byronic hero was aristocratic, or at least kind of above the social world. And I definitely think Heathcliff, although he's definitely not aristocratic in origins, he's nonetheless he has a superiority complex. He comes to look down on others and kind of enslaves them. The Byronic hero was seen as desirable, but also dangerous, very, very mysterious, had a very mysterious kind of aura about him. Byronic heroes tend to be rebellious. They tend to rebel against social norms. Nevertheless, they tend to be morally and erotically corrupt. But kind of it's all a bit of a mystery with the bad boy. They tend to be bad, but kind of made bad by society. So in terms of representations of masculinity in the period where we're looking at, kind of as we move from the Regency to the Victorian to the late Victorian period, you did have on the one hand the well-polished gentlemen like Fitzwilliam Darcy and Charles Bingley, and then on the other hand you did have this more radical Byronic figure like Heathcliff, who was very morally vexed. I might ask, now that I've given you a very kind of rustic, kind of jagged summary of the Byronic hero, was Wickham at all slightly Byronic, or is that taking it a little too far? I fear I kind of maybe throwing you in the deep end, seeing I've just given you one slide on the Byronic hero. Was Wickham a bad boy?
I think you could argue that he was a Byronic hero, especially with that idea of bad made bad. Like, we don't actually know like what caused Wickham to go sour, I guess, but he was, he's from a lower class and he was trying to, become upper class, and he had some bad experiences, I guess, so he did become bad.
Yeah, I feel like there's a bit of Byronic romantic hero in him, particularly the way he wins the charms of women. But Austen kind of says that he kind of just had this parasitic nature. She describes him as being very worthless, but also, how does she describe him? She says, as he grew up, he just became wasteful. He became a spendthrift. He just couldn't stick to anything. And he just realized that I could just kind of lounge my way through life, which I think is a little different, although there are elements of the Byronic hero in Wickham. It's a bit different because Wickham doesn't seem to have any moral values except his own kind of selfish desires. I know I'm being a bit harsh on Wickham, but I do kind of feel like he kind of gets his comeuppances in the end, although we don't really see into his mind because Austen paints him in such a way. I do think this question also feeds into the question of whether Jane Austen was a romantic. Some of you did, when you wrote your first assessments, often associated Jane Austen with romanticism. She definitely wrote romances, but the question of whether she had a romantic ideology, like believing in kind of equal rights and believing in political radical values, things like the French Revolution, believing in the value of emotion over reason, a little bit ambiguous when it comes to Austen. And perhaps one way you can see further into that is this question about whether Wickham is romanticized and has a Byronic element, or he doesn't. I've got another stunning portrait here of Lord Byron. He really loved posing. Here he is playing kind of a bit of an Ottoman type Pasha figure with a beautiful moustache. He was bisexual. I think he may have been interspecies as well. If anyone reads Don Juan, there's some scenes with some animals that are very confronting. So he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He went way out there on the sexual spectrum. I do think there is an exoticism to Heathcliff, which we often miss, that kind of makes him a bit Byronic. So Nellie kind of speculates upon Heathcliff when she says, "Tell me whether you don't think yourself rather handsome. I'll tell you I do. You're fit for a prince in disguise. Who knows but your father was Emperor of China and your mother an Indian queen, each of them able to buy up with 1 week's income Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange together. And you were kidnapped by wicked sailors and brought to England. Were I in your place, I would frame high notions of my birth, and the thoughts of what I was should give me courage and dignity to support the oppressions of a little farmer." So I do think Lord Byron kind of did become a bit of a symbol of rebellion and a symbol for people who didn't really have much of an identity to kind of cling to, because Byron was so polymorphous. He was open to accepting kind of all different types of identity. Does anyone know, before I move on to look at some other aspects of the Byronic hero, how Lord Byron died? No. No. Anyone else want to take a guess? Maybe I won't tell you the answer, and I'll say there's a wonderful museum in Melbourne called the Hellenic Museum, and they have a whole exhibition area on Lord Byron, because Lord Byron became a very important figure to the history of modern Greece. So if you ever have time to go to the Hellenic Museum in Melbourne, go there and you'll find all about Lord Byron and how he died, and why the Greeks so loved Lord Byron. We're almost at the end of today's session. I want to just mention something about one aspect of the Byronic hero, but also maybe a figure that kind of preceded the Byronic hero. And this kind of points to the idea of the ethical dilemma of evil as it's represented in Pride and in Wuthering Heights, sorry. Another type of heroic figure that we kind of find lurking in the background is the famous British poet John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. His depiction of Satan. We're going kind of way back here to the late 17th century, but has anyone heard of Paradise Lost? Kind of, we're going way back here. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, who brought mortal taste and woe into the world. A very, very famous, beautiful epic poem. Probably if you wanted to know about a poem that you probably should read that's kind of very central to the modern world, I would recommend Paradise Lost. It's basically the story of Satan's damnation. He's sent to hell, and the story of his basic corruption of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, told from the perspective of Satan himself. And a bit like Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, we get this perspective of evil, of an evildoer, but also the morality that really lurks behind Milton's Satan. John Milton kind of wrote Paradise Lost after the English Civil Wars in the middle of the 17th century, when the revolutionaries who kind of achieved a republic in Britain, some of you may not know this, but England was once a republic, didn't last very long. After they got thrown out, John Milton was a Republican. He wrote Paradise Lost. And to a certain extent, it's a contemplation upon where does one go after you've been kind of outcast as a rebel. And you definitely see this. And the reason why I'm mentioning it is Heathcliff is a rebel. The real question that kind of often kind of gets missed with Milton's Satan, but also with Heathcliff, and we might end by asking this, is Heathcliff a rebel with a cause? Does Heathcliff have a cause to his evil? Is he Rebel Without a Cause? I think it's a James Dean film, or maybe it's Rebel with a Cause. Do people just rebel for the sake of rebelling? Does Heathcliff have a cause behind his rebellious nature? What's his motive? Why is he doing what he's doing? What drives all this Gothic transgression, all this horror, all this violence, all this sublime aesthetics? Caitlin's kind of saying revenge. I'm pretty sure if I can read those lips, read my lips, revenge. It is a revenge narrative, right? In the same way that Hamlet, for instance, is a revenge story. Hamlet's dad gets killed, Hamlet comes back for revenge. Is revenge a very common narrative structure in the West? Thinking of James Brown, The Big Payback. Can anyone think of any narratives about revenge? Contemporary ones?
Mean Girls, but that's not really a book, it's a movie.
No, that's fine.
Okay,
What's
yeah,
Mean
Mean
Girls about, Olivia? I've heard of it, and I've heard of it recently in the context of a senator who recently passed away, and Mean Girls was getting thrown around because they thought that maybe she was being bullied.
It's basically about a girl who moves from Africa and who was homeschooled her whole life and then goes to like a public school. And then she makes friends with two characters named Janice and Damien who have it out for like the popular people called the Plastics. So then they send the new girl in to be with a group of Plastics, and then she kind of becomes like them. And then in the end, one of the Plastics gets hit by a bus, and yeah. That's the story in a nutshell.
Is it just revenge that powers Heathcliff's kind of, is he just a rebel for the sake of getting revenge?
Well, I thought that maybe, I don't know, this might be way out of the field, but I thought maybe to make a name for himself, because maybe he didn't have anything. We don't really know where he comes from. No one ever really cared about him. I thought maybe it was like his way of dealing with the fact that he was alone, and so he just did it so people would be afraid of him.
Mm. Yeah, his revenge is definitely kind of somewhat multi-directional. He directs revenge at particularly the Linton family by eloping with Isabella. He gets revenge on Hindley by making him a drunkard who doesn't really want to live anymore and tries to kill himself. He gets revenge by rendering Hareton Earnshaw illiterate. He gets revenge on Catherine because she betrayed her heart. But I do think, and I'm coming into bat for Heathcliff here, he does seem to be doing everything for this love that he's lost. Like there is this eternal driving force, and I think it's central to most Gothic narratives where love comes in and trumps everything. I'm thinking particularly, some of you may not have read the novel Dracula, but you would have seen perhaps the film. One of them, you've never seen Dracula. India, you've got to see Dracula. Melinda, Soleil, Renz, have you not seen Dracula? Who has not seen or heard or read of Dracula? I have not. You guys are all crossing. I can't believe this. You guys have been living under these like generational rocks. You've all got to create your plans for your essays, write excellent essays, and then we can watch Dracula together and you can understand. The reason why I bring this up is because Dracula is essentially, I haven't seen Mean Girls. No, I haven't seen Mean Girls. Sorry. Dracula is a canonical Western novel of profound significance. Mean Girls needs to survive another 100 years, and maybe I'll read it if I'm still alive then. Dracula is a story about a guy that travels back in time to find true love. He becomes a vampire and lives off people's blood so that he can live forever. But the whole motive behind all his vampirism and evil doings is just because he fell in love with this chick long ago in the Middle Ages, and he's staying alive because she died tragically so that kind of they can be together. I do see this as the central kind of driving force behind Heathcliff. So to return to that question about morality in Wuthering Heights, I do think part of the romanticism and the Gothic romanticism here is that Heathcliff will do anything for love. He'll kill people for love. His love for Cathy has no morality. It transgresses all types of barriers. Ryan says, sounds like the Shadow Moon series. It probably does, because we're talking about an archetype here, an archetype of a type of devotional animal, very dog-like, very, very dog-like in his devotion to Kathy and devotion to love. So I do think there is a moral to Wuthering Heights, but it's very amoral and very selfish. On that note, I think we'll leave it for today, because it's 8:48 and you guys have kind of done a lot. You've had to digest a lot of talk on the Gothic. Hopefully the sublime sunk in and you now know that it's not just a tasty treat. It's the feeling we get and the pleasure we get from seeing kind of terrifying things and the way those terrifying things become embedded in Western culture. A lot of violence does power a lot of the narratives we tell each other today. So yeah, does anyone have any questions about the Gothic? Because I've still got about 16 slides that I didn't get through, but I did cover a lot. Yeah, any questions about the Gothic? Or any questions generally about Wuthering Heights? Because we'll be leaving Wuthering Heights tonight and moving on to Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is very, 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 very beautiful, but a very sad story. Before I talk a little bit about Tess, does anyone have any questions? Because I would like to answer any questions you have. I'll take that as a no. Those of you, this will be the last thing I'll mention, those of you who are not going to have the time to read Tess, and you may have decided, I'm going to focus on Wuthering Heights for my essay, please do watch an adaptation of Tess so we can kind of have some good class discussion about Tess. On Collaborate, you'll notice in the pre-class activities, I might send out a link tomorrow in the kind of universal email I send out in the morning. You've got 3 choices, I believe. I do think the best adaptation of Tess, the best adaptation ever made, is by Roman Polanski. It's a very vexed adaptation because of what Roman Polanski kind of got booted out of America for doing. But nonetheless, it's probably the best adaptation, and there won't be a better adaptation made. So if you don't have the time to read Tess, at least watch an adaptation. It's a very beautiful film. It's a very sad film, but nonetheless, it does tell the narrative somewhat close. So yeah, you'd be rewarded both through a stimulating film as well as participating in discussion and knowing the narrative by watching Tess. Has anyone seen the adaptation yet? Is anyone on there Collaborate? Can India, I think it might be in pre-class readings somewhere. It's just, mine always gets logged out. It's no big deal. I think it may be in the pre-class activities for session for next week, because you'll notice in the Collaborate, we had this, Camille, you've got thumbs up, you found it?
Yeah, I think it's the pre-session for the first test session.
Yeah, so please ignore that tomorrow's session, Thursday, does say excursion to the NGV, but of course we can't go on that because this is a night class. What I might say though is you guys should go to the NGV and apply your romance and realism lenses, because you'll definitely see a lot of paintings that have aspects of the Gothic, have aspects of Romanticism, and then you'll see a lot of paintings that are very realistic. I do often wonder, like, kind of, like, it would have been good to have had that excursion, but I do feel like I would have been forcing you to have kind of gone a fair way out to go to the NGV. Is anyone disappointed our excursion? I had to cancel it. Don't all jump in. Pretty Devo. Soleil's got sad face. Good, good. You can go on your own excursion. Go on your own excursion. The art's there for you, and it's worth seeing. We have some really nice paintings. Some of them aren't so good, but some of them are very good. But yeah, I might call it a night if you guys are ready to split. because yeah, I'm somewhat tired. But yeah, I might kind of, if anyone does want to take me up on the feedback I gave and wants me to run through stuff, I might suggest tomorrow before class could be a good time. Yeah, maybe shoot me an email and yeah, we can discuss, because that would be good. I'm totally exhausted and I can't stop talking. Yeah.
Could I? Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask, Chris, you mentioned that you might sort of maybe make a video or discuss some of the essay topics. Is
Yes.
that something that you were still thinking of, or maybe?
I'm still like trying to squeeze in time to do it, and I think I'll try to get it done on Friday.
Mhm.
So I'll upload them. I know it's not like as soon as people would like it. It's just I've got, well, I don't think I can, because I've got to read Tess again before tomorrow, and so I'll make them on Friday. Camille, which question would you like me to make a video on? Because I'm not going to be able to make them on all 10. So
I'm looking at the question 8 about the animals. I really like that one.
oh, great. Yeah, no one's ever written about that. So it'll be good. Yeah, I will make a mini video, and it'll be me just rambling on about certain sections of the text and where I think there's some areas for analysis here, because I think the question is a bit vague. So I will talk a lot about, like, for instance, Thomas Hardy kind of represents animals quite a lot and does quite a lot of analogizing between Tess's oppression and the oppression of animals. Whereas when we looked at Wuthering Heights, a lot of personifications going on there in terms of the way certain animals get represented, but also violent types of animal behaviors. And I might also mention something about Heathcliff seems to be very much like an endling. And during that period, a lot of animals in Yorkshire were kind of going extinct. And in a way, that's what happens to Heathcliff. Because he has no companionate species, he does end up like an endling. He is the last of his kind, which is very Gothic, but also very ecological in that sense. So yeah, Camille, I'll definitely make a video on question 8. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. That'd be awesome.
Question 8. Yeah. Cool bananas. Yeah, any other kind of questions? I think Muwari.
Just quickly wanted to could I take you up on that offer for me speaking before class?
Yeah, totally. I mentioned pretty much the ideas were like spot on in your thing. It was just the way they were getting put together. And I do think it'll just take me going, now you just need to do this here and you just need to do that there. And but I do think generally, and it's kind of similar across the board, for a lot of you, I do think it's more read your writing out aloud, because often there's a disconnect between your writing textually and the way you speak normally. So that when you read it out aloud, and I know it's kind of embarrassing, but hey, the embarrassment is better to be embarrassed like kind of before you submit something. It's not so much embarrassment, it's just I don't like reading my writing out aloud until I've edited it and edited it and edited it. That's the really good thing about writing, right? Is you can make the world perfect with language, whereas in the Sarisha, sorry, you've got your hand up. I stopped rambling.
Yes. Sorry, I'm working tomorrow. I'll finish my work at 5:30, so I don't think I can come a bit earlier. Is there any possibility I can discuss about my assessment after class?
Yes. All right. So maybe what we'll do, Muwari, is maybe you come at say 4, no, not 4, 5, and it's just I tend to rant, and I kind of it'll take me an hour to kind of diffuse my ranting, and then Sarisha, kind of if you hang around after class, we'll continue on there.
Thank you.
I did really think it was just formatting and phrasing that was the issue, and I kind of often feel like kind of it's so simple, like it shouldn't be that hard. Because it is kind of, yeah, it's not too hard to kind of fix those things up. So it'll be cool. So I'll
Thank
see you
you.
tomorrow at 5 and we'll continue on after Tess. I
Okay.
will be totally exhausted though, because I've got to wake up at 3 this morning.
Oh no.
You look, sorry, Murari, how's the COVID going?
Horrible.
Yeah.
Horrible.
Yeah. I know.
Out of breath. The little one caught it as well, so that was horrible.
Yeah. Well, if you need to request an extension, please do, because you've got COVID. And, you know, I don't think that's going to get knocked back, is it?
Yeah, I'll see, because I've kind of got it planned out. Hopefully I can finish in time, but because I missed a class, I feel like I might, but I don't know. I'll see how I go. I'll
Yeah, look, definitely bring along your plan as well.
Yeah.
Because we can discuss that too. Yeah, any other, Soleil, Dominic, Ryan, Camille? I feel like some of you may be asleep.
Thank
What's the
you,
time?
Chris.
No worries.
I'll see you at 5 tomorrow.
Yeah. What's the time, Camille, over there, wherever you are?
It's 4.
Oh my God.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have to get up at 3, so yeah, it is, but at least I get to see the photos. Hey, where are these pictures? I want to check them out before you go, Caitlin.
Are you going to the botanical garden?
Hey?
Are you going to that flower exhibition?
No, my sister's a florist, and she gets the flowers in the morning and she needs someone to help her. So I've got to get up at 3 and get the flowers with her. So it's going to be like, I haven't been up at 3 in a while, but I like it. I like going and seeing where they get all the flowers, because it's just this big flower factory. It's kind of sad in a way, because flowers aren't supposed to be these commodities that we use, but you do get to see all the flowers. Yeah, that does look really, really beautiful, Caitlin. I'm just looking at your image here. Is that rain in one of them? Is it rain hitting the water? I think it is. Yeah, I think it's rain hitting the water. Yeah, that's like the Isle of the Dead in that famous Arnold Böcklin painting. Yeah, that is very Gothic. You should write it up as a story, as a romance. Well, you'll get there. I'm going to try and write a romance about Charlotte Lucas. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Diary of Blood. Really? I'll check it out. Yeah. That sounds really interesting. I'll check it out. I will.
On that note too, Chris, I was wondering if you had read Only the Animals?
No.
Quite fond of them. It's a piece of literary fiction, and I had to study it in Year 12 literature, and it's like an anthology of all the different like conflicts and wars that humans have had, but each like short story is through the perspective like of a different animal's eyes. And it's like it's just incredible to analyze. But I remember you saying that you like animals, so I thought that that would probably interest you.
Yeah, no, that's what I focus on in my research. So I will check that out. Only the animals. I've got these written down. Dowry of blood, only the animals. Yeah, I often kind of. Yeah, animals are very sad in a way because they don't have rights. But I think that's the next step in our development as a species. We'll move from human rights to animal rights. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah, it takes a long time. Yeah, I'm with the Dalai Lama, who kind of, when he got booted out of China, out of Tibet, sorry, not China, Tibet, kind of said, you know, it may take a long time, but in the end, the good will prevail. It just takes a long time, particularly if you're, say, someone like, take Gandhi, for instance, or a pacifist. If you want to achieve an end peacefully, you're in for the long haul, because most of what rules the world is might. But the right kind of will prevail. It just takes a lot of moral perseverance. So yeah, I can't remember how I got here, but oh yeah, the animals. I will check that out, Soleil. Animals, only the animals. Hey, Dominic, I kind of feel like either you're snoozing or you're waiting around very, very patiently to ask a question. I think he's gone. Can we call it a day? I've got to go to sleep. Thanks, guys. But I'll see you tomorrow. And check out a version of Tess. Check out a version of Tess, please. You'll enjoy it.
Bye.
Yeah. See you, Sarissa. See you, Sully.
Thank you. Bye.